The village of Willowbrook had always taken great pride in its annual summer fete. For weeks beforehand the residents discussed little else. The church committee argued amiably over flower arrangements. The women's society debated the proper quantity of sponge cakes. Children rehearsed songs they would inevitably forget the moment they stood before an audience. On the second Saturday of June, the village green was transformed into a cheerful scene of bunting, white tents, and polished wooden stalls. The weather, which had threatened rain all week, had unexpectedly turned glorious. By noon the fete was in full swing. Mrs. Eleanor Finch sat quietly at a small table near the tea-tent, observing the festivities with calm interest. At 76, she had become a familiar figure throughout Willowbrook. Her silver hair was neatly pinned beneath a pale blue hat, and her knitting rested in her lap. Most villagers regarded her as a pleasant old widow. A few knew better. Mrs. Finch possessed an extraordinary gift for understanding people. Years of observation had taught her that human nature rarely changed. Pride, jealousy, greed, fear, and love appeared in every generation, wearing only slightly different clothes. She sipped her tea while watching the crowd. Children chased one another between stalls. The vicar attempted to win a coconut and failed spectacularly. Several ladies exchanged gossip beneath the flower marquee, and near the center of the green stood the guest of honor, Mr. Leonard Ashcombe. Tall, handsome despite his 60 years, and remarkably wealthy, Ashcombe owned the largest estate in the county. His recent announcement had caused considerable excitement. After decades abroad in business, he had returned permanently to Willowbrook and pledged substantial donations to village projects. Everyone admired him, or so it seemed. Mrs. Finch noticed things others overlooked. She noticed that Miss Clara Bennet, who managed the village library, refused to meet Ashcombe's eyes. She noticed the strained smile worn by Dr. Henry Pierce whenever Ashcombe approached. She noticed Ashcombe himself glancing repeatedly toward the old clock tower beyond the church, not fearfully, expectantly, as though awaiting something. The observation lodged quietly in her mind. At 1:30, the mayor invited Ashcombe to address the crowd. A small platform had been erected beside the church. The villagers gathered eagerly. Ashcombe stepped onto the stage amid enthusiastic applause. "My friends," he began warmly, "it is a pleasure to be home once more." The applause grew louder. He smiled. He spoke of village improvements, of restoring the old schoolhouse, of funding repairs to the church roof, of preserving Willowbrook's traditions. The audience listened attentively. Then something happened. At first nobody understood. Ashcombe paused. His expression changed. For a fraction of a second, surprise flashed across his face. His hand moved toward his chest. A murmur spread through the crowd. Ashcombe staggered. The mayor reached for him. Too late. The wealthy benefactor collapsed heavily onto the wooden platform. Gasps erupted everywhere. Women screamed. Several people rushed forward. Dr. Pierce immediately pushed through the crowd. "Stand back," he shouted. The villagers obeyed. A terrible silence descended. Dr. Pierce knelt beside the fallen man. He examined him quickly, then more carefully. Finally he stood. His face had become pale. "He's dead." The words seemed impossible. Only moments earlier Ashcombe had been speaking, laughing. Now he lay motionless upon the platform. The silence deepened. Then came the strangest detail of all. Ashcombe's face wore a smile. Not the natural smile he had displayed during his speech. This was different, a fixed, unsettling expression. Almost triumphant, almost mocking. Several villagers later claimed they would never forget it. The smile remained frozen there, even in death. As people stared in disbelief, Mrs. Finch felt an unexpected chill. The expression disturbed her, not because it was frightening, because it seemed wrong, entirely wrong. The doctor knelt once more beside the body. His brow furrowed. Something troubled him. Mrs. Finch noticed that as well. Nearby, Clara Bennet had turned deathly white. A young man named Thomas Red appeared equally shaken. Across the crowd, an elderly gardener abruptly left the scene and hurried away. Others were crying, others whispering. And already Mrs. Finch knew the gossip would begin. A death in a village was never merely a death. It became a story, a puzzle, a collection of rumors. And when the deceased happened to be the wealthiest man in the county, the rumors multiplied rapidly. Within an hour the fete had ended. By evening, Willowbrook buzzed with speculation. Some insisted Ashcombe had suffered a heart attack. Others whispered about old enemies. Several recalled arguments from years before. One woman claimed she had seen someone tampering with Ashcombe's drink. Another swore she had overheard threats. The stories grew more elaborate with every retelling. Mrs. Finch listened carefully. Listening, she had learned long ago, was often more valuable than asking questions. People revealed themselves through gossip, what they feared, what they hoped, what they wished were true. That evening she sat in her cottage garden watching twilight settle over Willowbrook. The roses stirred gently in the breeze. A blackbird sang from a nearby hedge. Everything appeared peaceful once more. Yet beneath the calm surface something had changed. Somewhere in the village someone was frightened. Somewhere a secret had begun to unravel. And, most troubling of all, Mrs. Finch could not stop thinking about the smile on Leonard Ashcombe's face. She had seen many expressions in her lifetime. Terror, relief, but never quite that one. The smile suggested a man who had discovered something moments before he died. Something important. Something that perhaps only he understood. Mrs. Finch folded her hands thoughtfully. The police would arrive tomorrow. An investigation would begin. Suspects would emerge. The village would whisper and speculate. But already she sensed that the truth lay hidden in a place nobody was looking. And if experience had taught her anything, it was this. The smallest detail was often the most important. Far away the church bell struck 8. The sound echoed across Willowbrook. A peaceful village, a respected man, a sudden death. And somewhere in the darkness a murderer waited, patiently, confidently, believing the secret was safe. The following morning Willowbrook awoke beneath a blanket of low grey clouds. The village seemed quieter than usual. Even the birds appeared reluctant to disturb the uneasy silence that lingered after the shocking events of the summer fete. Yet silence in an English village was rarely genuine. Behind lace curtains and neatly trimmed hedges conversations had already begun. By 9 o'clock every household possessed a theory. By 10 o'clock most possessed 3. At 11 the tea-room was full. Mrs. Hargreaves, owner of the Willowbrook tea-rooms, had never witnessed such brisk business on a Sunday morning. Every table was occupied. Every conversation concerned one subject. Leonard Ashcombe. "Heart attack," declared Mr. Palmer confidently. "I've said so from the beginning." "Nonsense," replied Mrs. Carter. "My cousin's husband had a heart attack. He certainly didn't look like that." "What do you mean?" "The smile." Several people nodded. The smile had become the most discussed detail in the village. Nobody seemed able to forget it. Some considered it sinister. Others thought it mysterious. A few regarded it as evidence of poisoning. By midday someone had already suggested secret societies. Another hinted at foreign spies. A third insisted Ashcombe had been cursed. The theories grew more imaginative with every retelling. Meanwhile, at Rose Cottage, Mrs. Eleanor Finch sat by her window with a cup of tea. She paid little attention to wild speculation. Facts interested her. People interested her even more. A gentle knock sounded at her door. She opened it even more. A gentle knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find Lucy Martin, the vicar's daughter. Lucy was 24, intelligent, and usually cheerful. Today she appeared troubled. "May I come in, Mrs. Finch?" "Of course, dear." Lucy entered. Mrs. Finch poured another cup of tea. For several moments neither spoke. Then Lucy sighed. "The whole village feels strange." "That is understandable. It isn't only the death." "No?" Lucy hesitated. "It's everyone. They seem frightened." Mrs. Finch nodded slowly. Fear interested her. Fear often appeared before truth. "When people become frightened," she said softly, "it usually means they know more than they realize." Lucy considered this. Then she lowered her voice. "I heard something yesterday." "Oh!" Just before Mr. Ashcombe gave his speech, Mrs. Finch looked up. "What did you hear?" Lucy leaned forward. "I was helping near the flower tent. Mr. Ashcombe was speaking to someone." "Did you see who?" "No." "The voice?" "It sounded like a woman." Mrs. Finch remained silent. "What were they saying?" "I only caught one sentence." Lucy swallowed. "Mr. Ashcombe said you should have told me years ago." The room became quiet. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the window. Mrs. Finch thought carefully. "Did he sound angry?" "No." "Surprised?" Lucy nodded. "Very surprised." Mrs. Finch thanked her. The information was interesting. Not because it explained anything, because it raised questions. Questions were often more valuable than answers. The police arrived shortly after noon. The investigation was led by Inspector Arthur Blackwood. Tall, practical, and experienced, Blackwood had solved numerous cases throughout the county. He disliked gossip. He disliked speculation. Most of all, he disliked amateur detectives. By early afternoon he had established a temporary office inside the village hall. Witnesses were interviewed one by one. Statements were collected. Timelines were assembled. The doctor provided preliminary findings. By evening, Inspector Blackwood possessed one important piece of information. Leonard Ashcombe had not died naturally. Poison had been found in his system. The news spread through Willowbrook like wildfire. Murder. The word transformed everything. A heart attack could be tragic. Murder was personal. Murder meant someone in the village had deliberately killed a man. The realization unsettled everyone. Doors were locked earlier than usual. Curtains closed sooner. Neighbors examined one another with new suspicion, and hidden behind polite smiles old grudges began resurfacing. The next day brought further revelations. Leonard Ashcombe had not been universally loved. In fact, several people possessed reasons to dislike him. Some possessed stronger reasons than others. Miss Clara Bennet, the librarian, had once been engaged to Ashcombe many years earlier. The engagement had ended suddenly. Nobody knew exactly why. Clara had never married. Ashcombe had left Willowbrook shortly afterward. The village had long forgotten the scandal. Now it returned. Dr. Henry Pierce had recently argued with Ashcombe regarding land ownership near the medical clinic. Witnesses confirmed several heated disagreements. Thomas Read, a young businessman struggling with debt, had reportedly requested a substantial loan from Ashcombe only weeks earlier. The request had been denied. And there were others, former employees, disappointed relatives, business associates. The list continued growing. Each new discovery fueled fresh rumors. That afternoon, Mrs. Finch took a slow walk through the village. She greeted neighbors, admired gardens, exchanged pleasantries. To an observer, she appeared entirely unconcerned. In reality, she was working. People spoke more freely when they believed nobody was investigating them. Near the churchyard, she encountered Clara Bennet. The librarian looked exhausted. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. "You seem tired, dear." Clara managed a weak smile. "I haven't slept much. None of us have." For a moment neither woman spoke. Then Clara said quietly, "They think I hated him." Mrs. Finch watched her carefully. "Did you?" The younger woman looked away. "I thought I did." "Past tense?" Clara nodded. "After enough years, anger becomes tiring." There was genuine sadness in her voice, not bitterness, not hatred, something else, regret perhaps. Mrs. Finch filed the observation away. People rarely lied successfully with their emotions. Later that evening another detail reached the village. Inspector Blackwood had discovered that the poisoned drink belonged specifically to Ashcombe. Nobody else had access to it. The glass had been prepared shortly before his speech. That narrowed the possibilities considerably. And immediately suspicion focused upon those who had been near the refreshment tent. Several names emerged repeatedly. One stood above all others, Thomas Read. Witnesses claimed he had been seen handling trays of drinks shortly before the speech. Others remembered him arguing with Ashcombe weeks earlier. His financial troubles were widely known. By nightfall, half the village had already convicted him. Mrs. Finch remained unconvinced, not because Thomas appeared innocent, but because matters seemed too convenient. Far too convenient. The obvious answer often concealed a deeper one. Before bed, Mrs. Finch sat once more beside her window. Rain drifted softly across the village. Lights glowed behind distant curtains. Somewhere, she knew, a murderer was listening to the rumors with satisfaction, watching suspicion settle upon another person, feeling safe, for now. Mrs. Finch's knitting rested forgotten in her lap. Her thoughts had returned once again to Leonard Ashcombe's final expression, the smile. The strange, unsettling smile. Everyone viewed it as a mystery, but perhaps they were asking the wrong question. Perhaps the smile itself was not important. Perhaps what mattered was why someone wanted everyone to notice it. Mrs. Finch frowned thoughtfully, and for the first time since the murder, she felt the faint outline of a pattern beginning to emerge. A very small pattern. But patterns, she knew, were where murderers made their mistakes, and somewhere within Willowbrook a mistake had already been made. The rain had cleared by Tuesday morning. Willowbrook emerged from the storm washed clean and glistening beneath pale sunshine. Water droplets sparkled on hedges, and the village green, scene of Leonard Ashcombe's death only 3 days earlier, looked almost peaceful again. Almost. The murder remained the subject of every conversation. Every visitor to the post office discussed it. Every customer at the bakery mentioned it. Every household possessed fresh rumors, and at the center of those rumors stood Thomas Read. The young businessman found himself increasingly isolated. People who had greeted him warmly a week ago now crossed the street to avoid him. Conversations stopped when he entered a room. Whispers followed him wherever he went. Thomas noticed. The strain showed clearly on his face. Mrs. Eleanor Finch observed this one morning while purchasing stamps at the post office. The young man appeared tired and frustrated. More importantly, he appeared genuinely bewildered. That interested her. In her experience, guilty people worried about discovery. Innocent people worried about accusation. The distinction was subtle but significant. As Thomas departed, Mrs. Finch watched him walk quickly down the street. Then she turned her attention elsewhere, to Mrs. Agnes Turner, the postmistress, a woman who knew nearly everything that happened in Willowbrook. Mrs. Turner lowered her voice. "They'll arrest him soon." "Will they?" Mrs. Finch replied mildly. "Everyone says so. Everyone says many things." The postmistress leaned closer. "My nephew works at county headquarters. He says Inspector Blackwood is quite certain." Mrs. Finch smiled politely. Inspectors often became certain too quickly. Human nature encouraged certainty. Evidence preferred patience. That afternoon, Inspector Blackwood conducted another round of interviews. His investigation had uncovered several important facts. The poison used in the murder was uncommon. It had acted rapidly. Most importantly, it had been administered shortly before Ashcombe's speech. The timeline appeared increasingly narrow. Only a handful of people had access to the refreshments, and Thomas Red remained among them. The inspector felt confident, almost confident enough to make an arrest, yet one small problem continued to trouble him: motive. Thomas certainly needed money. That much was undeniable. His business was struggling. Debts had accumulated. Ashcombe had refused assistance, but financial desperation alone did not entirely satisfy Blackwood. Murder required opportunity. It required courage, and sometimes it required something deeper, something personal. He spent the afternoon reviewing witness statements. Most supported his theory. One did not. The statement came from Clara Bennet, the village librarian. According to her account, she had seen Thomas near the refreshment tent, but she insisted he had left nearly 15 minutes before Ashcombe received his drink. The timing complicated matters. Blackwood disliked complications. Meanwhile, Mrs. Finch paid a visit to the church, not because she was particularly interested in religion that day, because people often revealed surprising things when discussing unrelated matters. The vicar, Reverend Collins, welcomed her warmly. They spoke about the weather, the fit, the unfortunate cancellation of several community events. Only after 15 minutes did the conversation drift naturally toward the murder. "The village is frightened," the vicar admitted. "Quite understandably. I cannot remember a death affecting people this strongly." Mrs. Finch nodded. "Because it wasn't merely a death." The Reverend looked thoughtful. "No." After a pause he added, "Mr. Ashcombe changed many lives." "How so?" "Some for better." "And others?" The vicar hesitated. "Not everyone welcomed his return." "That was interesting." "Did he have enemies?" "No open enemies." Mrs. Finch smiled faintly. Open enemies rarely committed successful murders. Later that day she encountered Dr. Henry Pierce near the medical clinic. The doctor appeared exhausted. His usually neat appearance had deteriorated noticeably. Dark shadows lingered beneath his eyes. "You look overworked." "I am." "Investigation?" "Partly." He sighed heavily. "I've spent half my week answering police questions." Mrs. Finch studied him. "Unpleasant?" "Very." The doctor rubbed his forehead. "Though I suppose it cannot be helped." For a moment they stood in silence. Then Mrs. Finch asked casually, "What did you think of Mr. Ashcombe?" Mrs. Finch asked casually, "What did you think of Mr. Ashcombe?" A curious expression crossed his face. Not anger, not affection, something more complicated. He was a difficult man. Difficult. He enjoyed knowing things. Mrs. Finch looked interested. "What sort of things?" The doctor immediately appeared uncomfortable. "Village matters." He gave a short laugh. "Every village has secrets." Then he quickly changed the subject. Mrs. Finch allowed him to do so, but she remembered every word, especially his discomfort. That evening brought an unexpected development. A search of Thomas Reed's office uncovered a bottle containing traces of the same poison used in the murder. The discovery electrified Willowbrook. Inspector Blackwood considered it decisive. The evidence seemed overwhelming. Financial motive, opportunity, and now poison. The following morning Thomas Reed was arrested. The village reacted with relief. Many residents welcomed the news. At last they believed the mystery was solved. The murderer had been found. Life could return to normal. Mrs. Finch remained unconvinced, very unconvinced. She sat quietly in her garden that afternoon, knitting forgotten beside her chair. Lucy Martin visited shortly afterward. They arrested Thomas. "So I heard. You don't seem surprised." "I am not." Lucy sat down. "You think he did it?" Mrs. Finch remained silent for several moments. Finally she asked, "Tell me, Lucy, if you wish to hide something, would you place it where everyone could find it?" Lucy frowned. "Of course not. Neither would I." The younger woman stared. Realization slowly appeared. "You mean the poison?" "Perhaps." Lucy felt a chill. The implication was obvious. Someone might have planted it. That night Mrs. Finch reviewed everything she knew. The strange smile. The mysterious conversation before the speech. The doctor's remarks about secrets. Thomas's arrest. The conveniently discovered poison. Individually, each fact seemed understandable. Together they felt wrong, like pieces from different puzzles forced into the same box. Something important was missing. The question was what? She rose and crossed to the window. Outside, darkness covered Willowbrook. A handful of lights glowed in distant cottages. The village appeared peaceful. Yet beneath that calm surface tensions were growing. Someone was lying, perhaps several people, and somewhere among those lies stood the truth. As she prepared for bed, one particular memory suddenly returned to her. A tiny observation from the day of the fete, so small she had almost forgotten it. Leonard Ashcombe had checked his pocket-watch several times before giving his speech, not casually, as though waiting for a specific moment, or a specific person. Mrs. Finch stopped. A curious feeling stirred within her. The observation might mean nothing, but it might mean everything, because people who wait for something often expect a meeting, and meetings frequently involve secrets. The thought remained with her long after she extinguished the lamp. Outside, the church clock struck midnight. Somewhere in Willowbrook, a murderer slept comfortably, believing suspicion had settled elsewhere. But for the first time since the arrest, Mrs. Finch felt certain of one thing. The investigation had not reached its end. It had only just begun. The arrest of Thomas Red brought a noticeable change to Willowbrook. For 2 days the village breathed more easily. People resumed ordinary conversations. The bakery once again discussed weather rather than murder. The tea-room returned to debates about gardening competitions and church fundraising. Children played on the green without overhearing frightened whispers from anxious adults. Yet beneath the surface uncertainty remained. It lingered in hesitant glances, in unfinished sentences, in the uncomfortable silence that occasionally followed the mention of Leonard Ashcombe's name. The official explanation seemed satisfactory, but not everyone believed it. Mrs. Eleanor Finch was among those who did not. She had lived long enough to recognize a familiar pattern. When a solution arrived too quickly, it often concealed a more complicated truth. And Thomas Reed's arrest had arrived very quickly indeed. Inspector Arthur Blackwood, however, felt considerably less doubtful. The evidence appeared persuasive. The poison found in Thomas's office matched traces recovered from Ashcombe's body. Several witnesses placed Thomas near the refreshment tent. His financial difficulties supplied an obvious motive. From the inspector's perspective, the case was nearly complete. Only one problem remained. Thomas Red refused to confess. During questioning, he maintained his innocence with stubborn consistency. For hours he answered every question, repeated every denial, offered every detail he could remember about the day of the fete. Yet his story never changed. "I didn't poison him." Blackwood had heard the statement dozens of times. The inspector sat across from him inside the county station. "Then explain the poison." "I can't." "You expect me to believe someone placed it in your office?" Thomas looked exhausted. "I know how it sounds. Do you?" The young man leaned forward. "But it's the truth." The inspector studied him. Years of experience had taught Blackwood to recognize deception. Yet Thomas did not behave like a man constructing lies. He behaved like a man trapped inside a nightmare. Blackwood found that deeply irritating, because it introduced doubt, and doubt complicated investigations. Back in Willowbrook, Mrs. Finch spent her morning in the village library. The building occupied a converted Victorian house near the church. Its shelves contained everything from agricultural manuals to forgotten novels. Clara Bennet greeted her warmly. The librarian appeared calmer than she had since the murder, though sadness still lingered in her expression. "You've come for a book?" "Perhaps." Mrs. Finch smiled. "Or perhaps for conversation." Clara laughed softly. "I should have expected that." They settled beside a window overlooking the churchyard. For several minutes they discussed literature. Then, naturally and without apparent effort, the conversation drifted elsewhere. toward Leonard Ashcombe, toward the past, toward memories. You knew him before he left the village. Clara nodded. Very well. A shadow crossed her face. At one time, Mrs. Finch waited patiently. Silence often encouraged honesty. Eventually Clara spoke. We were engaged. I know. We were very young. Her voice softened. And very foolish. There was no bitterness now, only melancholy. What ended it? The librarian stared out the window. For a long moment she said nothing. Leah. Mrs. Finch looked surprised. Leah? Clara nodded. A terrible lie. Whose? The younger woman hesitated. I never discovered that. The answer was unexpected. Mrs. Finch felt immediate interest. What happened? Clara folded her hands. Someone convinced Leonard that I had betrayed him. And you hadn't? No. The answer came instantly, without hesitation, without defensiveness. Mrs. Finch believed her. What did he do? He left. The librarian smiled sadly. He never asked if it was true. Neither woman spoke for several moments. Outside, a bell chimed somewhere in the village. Did he ever learn the truth? Clara's eyes grew distant. I think he did. Recently? A slight nod. Mrs. Finch remembered Lucy Martin's account. You should have told me years ago. The sentence suddenly acquired new significance. That afternoon another curious event occurred. A letter arrived at Rose Cottage. The envelope bore no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No signature. No greeting. Only a short message. Ask who feared Ashcombe's return most. Mrs. Finch read it twice, then a third time. The handwriting was disguised, the wording carefully vague. Someone wanted to communicate, but feared being identified. Very interesting. Most anonymous messages proved useless, yet occasionally they pointed towards something important. The question itself intrigued her. Who had feared Ashcombe's return? Not disliked, not hated. There was an important difference. Hatred looked backward. Fear looked forward. Fear suggested consequences. Mrs. Finch placed the letter carefully inside a drawer. The following morning she visited the church records office. Her reason appeared perfectly innocent. Family histories fascinated her. No one questioned an elderly lady researching village genealogy. For nearly 2 hours she examined old documents, marriage records, property transfers, historical correspondence. Most of it seemed entirely unrelated to murder. Then she found something unexpected. A name, not hidden, not secret, simply forgotten. Leonard Ashcombe had once served as trustee for a charitable fund established decades earlier. The fund involved several prominent village families, including one name that surprised her. Dr. Henry Pierce's father. Mrs. Finch leaned back thoughtfully. That was curious. Not evidence, not even a clue. Merely a connection. Yet murder investigations often depended upon forgotten connections, especially those buried beneath many years. That evening Inspector Blackwood returned to Willowbrook. His purpose was straightforward. He intended to reassure the villagers that progress continued. Instead, he encountered complications. Several new witness statements contradicted earlier testimony. One woman now claimed Thomas Reed had not been near the refreshment tent when she originally believed. Another admitted uncertainty regarding the timing. Memories, Blackwood reflected grimly, were unreliable creatures. The passage of time reshaped them. Rumors influenced them. Fear distorted them. The inspector disliked shifting testimony. It weakened certainty. And certainty remained important, especially if charges were to proceed. Later that night, Mrs. Finch sat beside her fireplace reviewing her thoughts. The pieces of the puzzle continued to accumulate, yet they refused to fit together. Thomas read, Clara Bennett. The mysterious lie from years ago. The anonymous letter. The charitable trust. The smile. Always the smile. Somehow everything connected. The challenge was discovering how. Her gaze drifted toward the window. Rain had begun again. Soft droplets tapped against the glass. The sound reminded her of something, a memory, a conversation long ago. Two sisters arguing over an inheritance. One had feared exposure. The other had feared loss. Everyone assumed greed motivated the crime. In reality, fear had been responsible. Fear was frequently stronger than greed, stronger than anger, stronger even than hatred. And suddenly she found herself returning to the anonymous message. Ask who feared Ashcombe's return most. Perhaps that was the correct question after all. Not who benefited from his death, not who disliked him, who feared him, who had something to lose, something important, something worth killing for. As the thought settled in her mind, another realization followed. Leonard Ashcombe had returned to Willowbrook after decades away. Yet within weeks of his return someone had murdered him. That suggested urgency. The killer had not acted years earlier. The killer had acted now. Because something had changed, or because Ashcombe had discovered something. Mrs. Finch felt a familiar stirring of excitement, the kind that appeared when a mystery began revealing its shape, not its solution, not yet, but its outline, and somewhere within that outline stood a respected resident of Willowbrook, someone trusted, someone admired, someone who had far more reason to fear Leonard Ashcombe than anyone yet suspected. The realization was unsettling, because in villages the most dangerous secrets were often hidden behind the most respectable faces, and Mrs. Finch had begun to suspect that Willowbrook possessed more than one respectable face concealing a lie. The weather brightened again on Thursday. Sunlight spilled across Willowbrook's stone cottages, illuminating window boxes overflowing with summer flowers. To a visitor the village would have appeared as charming and tranquil as ever. But appearances, Mrs. Eleanor Finch often reflected, were among the most deceptive things in the world. Behind neat curtains and polished front doors, Willowbrook was growing increasingly uneasy. The murder investigation had entered a new phase. The initial certainty surrounding Thomas Reed's arrest was beginning to crumble. Questions were multiplying, rumors were changing direction, and people who had once felt safe were starting to worry. Mrs. Finch noticed it everywhere, in lowered voices, in nervous smiles, in conversations that stopped abruptly when another person entered the room. Someone in Willowbrook was frightened, perhaps several people, and frightened people often made mistakes. On Friday morning, Inspector Blackwood received troubling news. Laboratory analysis had produced an unexpected conclusion. The poison found in Thomas Reed's office had indeed matched the poison used in Ashcombe's murder. But there was a complication. The bottle discovered in Thomas's office had been handled by multiple individuals. Fingerprints belonging to Thomas were present. That was hardly surprising. Yet several unidentified prints appeared as well. The discovery did not prove innocence. Neither did it prove guilt. It merely introduced uncertainty. And uncertainty irritated Inspector Blackwood tremendously. He sat in his temporary office reviewing reports for the third time. Nothing fit together as neatly as it had a few days earlier. The evidence remained persuasive, yet increasingly it felt arranged, almost as though someone had carefully constructed a path leading directly toward Thomas Reed. The inspector disliked that possibility, because if Thomas was innocent, the real killer remained free, and murderers rarely stopped making mistakes forever. That same afternoon, Mrs. Finch paid a visit to Mr. Alfred Morris. The elderly solicitor had retired years ago, but still maintained a modest office overlooking the village square. He possessed one quality Mrs. Finch valued greatly, an excellent memory. After exchanging pleasantries and discussing arthritis for several minutes, Mrs. Finch guided the conversation toward village history, specifically the charitable trusts she had recently discovered. Mr. Morris immediately became interested. "Good heavens," he said. "I haven't thought about that fund in years. It appears rather important. It once was." The solicitor adjusted his spectacles. The Ashcombe Community Trust? What was its purpose? Scholarships, medical assistance, village improvements. Mrs. Finch nodded. And who managed it? A small committee. Do you remember the members? Mr. Morris thought for a moment. Leonard Ashcombe's father. Dr. Pierce's father. Mrs. Finch remained silent. Reverend Matthews, the former vicar. He paused. And Charles Bennet, Mrs. Former vicar. He paused. And Charles Bennet, Mrs. Finch looked up sharply. Clara Bennet's father? Indeed. Very interesting. The connection widened. 3 families linked by a forgotten trust. 3 families now connected once again through murder. What happened to the fund? Mrs. Finch asked. The solicitor's expression changed slightly. A shadow crossed his face. That became rather unfortunate. How so? There was a disagreement. What sort of disagreement? Mr. Morris hesitated. A financial matter. Mrs. Finch waited. Eventually he continued. Some money disappeared. The room grew quiet. Stolen? No proof was ever found. But people suspected? Naturally. The old solicitor sighed. Everyone suspected everyone. Mrs. Finch felt a pulse of excitement. At last, not gossip, not speculation, a genuine secret from the past. Was anyone accused? No officially. But privately? Mr. Morris nodded. Relationships were destroyed. The significance was immediately obvious. Relationships, including perhaps Leonard Ashcombe's engagement to Clara Bennet. Mrs. Finch thanked him and departed. Her mind was already racing ahead. That evening she visited the library once again. Clara Bennet appeared surprised. "Back already?" "I'm afraid so." The librarian smiled. "I hope you've come for a happier subject." "I'm not sure I have." They settled beside the familiar window. For a few moments neither spoke. Then Mrs. Finch asked quietly, "Do you remember the Ashcombe Trust?" The reaction was immediate. Clara's face paled, only slightly, but enough. "Why do you ask? You remember it?" "Of course." Her voice had become careful. "My father served on the committee." Mrs. Finch nodded. "And money disappeared." The librarian looked away. For several seconds she remained silent. Finally she spoke. "People blame my father." Mrs. Finch felt a chill. "Was he guilty?" "No." The answer arrived instantly, without hesitation, without uncertainty, just as before. Mrs. Finch believed she was telling the truth, but belief and proof were different things. "What happened?" Clara folded her hands tightly. "Rumors spread. Who started them?"
"I never knew."
"And Leonard Ashcombe believed them?" A long silence followed. Then Clara nodded. Everything suddenly became clearer. The broken engagement, the mysterious lie, the decades of separation, the lingering sadness, all of it traced back to that forgotten scandal. Yet one question remained. If Clara's father had been innocent who had actually taken the money, the answer might have remained buried forever. But the following day brought a dramatic development. Inspector Blackwood received an anonymous package. Inside were photocopies of old financial records, records connected to the charitable trust. Someone had gone to considerable effort to locate them, someone who wanted them discovered. The documents revealed discrepancies, missing funds, altered entries, and among those signatures appeared a familiar name, Dr. Edward Pierce, Henry Pierce's father. Blackwood stared at the records for a long time. The implication was obvious, perhaps too obvious, yet it could not be ignored. News spread rapidly. By evening, Willowbrook buzzed with fresh speculation. Now attention shifted toward the Pierce family. Old rumors resurfaced. Forgotten accusations returned. Questions multiplied. Dr. Henry Pierce found himself under increasing scrutiny. The doctor reacted badly. Several villagers reported seeing him lose his temper publicly. Others described heated arguments. His normally calm demeanor began cracking under pressure. Mrs. Finch observed all this carefully, not because it proved guilt, because it revealed character. And character often mattered more than evidence. That night another unexpected event occurred. Someone broke into Leonard Ashcombe's estate. The intruder entered the study. Several drawers were searched, papers scattered across the floor. A cabinet was forced open, yet nothing valuable appeared stolen. The burglary puzzled everyone, including Inspector Blackwood. If theft had not been the motive, why break in? The answer seemed obvious. Someone had been searching for something specific, something connected to Ashcombe, something important enough to risk discovery. When Mrs. Finch learned of the incident, she felt a surge of certainty. The burglary mattered, perhaps more than anything discovered so far, because it suggested the killer remained frightened. Desperate people searched for evidence. Desperate people tried to destroy evidence, and desperation often led to mistakes. Late that evening, Mrs. Finch sat quietly in her garden. The village lay silent beneath the stars. A gentle breeze stirred the roses. Somewhere in the darkness an owl called. Her thoughts returned once more to Leonard Ashcombe. He had returned after decades away. Within weeks he had reconnected with old acquaintances. Within weeks he had discovered something. And within weeks he had been murdered. That sequence could not be coincidence. The missing trust funds, the broken engagement, the anonymous warnings, the burglary, all pointed toward the same conclusion. The answer lay in the past, not the present. A secret buried 20 years earlier had awakened. Someone had believed it safely forgotten. Then Leonard Ashcombe returned, and suddenly that secret became dangerous again. Mrs. Finch gazed toward the distant silhouette of Ashcombe Manor. A light still burned in one upstairs window where police officers continued their work. Somewhere among the papers, records, and memories of the past, the truth was waiting. She was certain of it, and equally certain of something else. The murder had never been about money. Money might have started the story, but it had not ended it. Number? The motive was something far more powerful. Something capable of surviving decades. Something capable of destroying friendships, engagements, reputations, and perhaps lives. Fear of exposure. Fear of disgrace. Fear of a truth finally coming to light. And whoever feared that truth most was becoming increasingly dangerous. The coming days, Mrs. Finch suspected, would prove just how dangerous. For secrets buried for 20 years rarely emerge quietly. and when they did, they often brought more than one victim with them. The second incident occurred 3 days after the break-in at Ashcombe Manor. It happened shortly before dawn. A gardener arriving for work noticed that a side door of the manor stood open. At first he assumed one of the police officers had forgotten to lock it. Then he saw the blood. A thin trail marked the stone floor of the conservatory. The gardener immediately alerted the authorities. Within an hour, Inspector Arthur Blackwood stood inside the glass-walled room, surveying the scene with growing concern. The blood belonged to Sergeant Miller, one of the officers assigned to guard the estate. He had been discovered unconscious behind a row of potted palms. Fortunately, his injuries were not fatal. Someone had struck him from behind, hard enough to render him unconscious, not hard enough to kill. Whoever had entered the manor had possessed a specific purpose. Once again, several rooms had been searched. Once again, nothing valuable appeared stolen. And once again, papers had been disturbed. The incident transformed the investigation. This was no longer merely a matter of solving a murder. Someone was actively interfering with the case. Someone was willing to assault a police officer. Inspector Blackwood's patience began wearing thin. Meanwhile, another mystery emerged. On the same morning, a village resident disappeared. Not permanently, not dramatically, but significantly enough to attract attention. The missing person was Alfred Morris, the retired solicitor. His house stood empty. His breakfast remained untouched, and no one knew where he had gone. By afternoon, concern spread throughout Willowbrook. Morris was elderly, reliable, a man of habit. He did not simply vanish. When Blackwood learned of the disappearance, he immediately ordered inquiries. No one had seen Morris since the previous evening. Several neighbors recalled hearing visitors. None could identify them. The timing disturbed him greatly. A police officer attacked. A key witness missing. The connection seemed obvious. Mrs. Eleanor Finch received the news while tending her roses. She listened quietly. Then she asked only one question. Who discovered he was missing? The messenger blinked. His housekeeper. Mrs. Finch thanked him and returned to her gardening. But her thoughts were far from flowers. The disappearance troubled her. Not because she feared for Alfred Morris, though she certainly did. What troubled her was the timing. The solicitor had recently discussed the trust scandal. He had confirmed important details, and now he had vanished. That suggested one of two possibilities. Either someone wanted to silence him, or someone feared what he might remember. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Finch paid a visit to Ashcombe Manor. Officially, she wished to deliver a basket of scones to the officers working there. Unofficially, she wished to look around. The police tolerated her presence reluctantly. Inspector Blackwood, despite his reservations, had begun to respect her observations. Not openly, certainly not publicly, but enough to permit occasional conversations. She found him standing inside the library. The inspector appeared exhausted. Another difficult day? You might say that. He gestured toward stacks of documents. I've spent hours examining papers. Any discoveries? None worth mentioning. Mrs. Finch smiled slightly. In her experience, those were often the most important discoveries. As they spoke, her attention wandered toward a collection of framed photographs displayed on a side table. Most were ordinary, family gatherings, hunting parties, village events. Then one photograph caught her eye, a group portrait, nearly 25 years old. 4 men stood together outside the church hall. She recognized them immediately. Leonard Ashcombe, Charles Bennett, Edward Pierce, and Reverend Matthews, the trustees of the old charitable fund. Nothing unusual there, yet something about the image troubled her. She moved closer, examined it carefully, then even more carefully. A curious expression crossed her face. Inspector Blackwood noticed. "What is it?" Mrs. Finch did not answer immediately. Instead, she pointed. "Who is that?" The inspector leaned forward. At first he saw nothing remarkable. Then he understood. A 5th person stood partly hidden at the edge of the photograph, almost unnoticed, almost cropped out. A young woman. Blackwood frowned. "I don't recognize her." Neither did Mrs. Finch, but the discovery excited her. Because someone had deliberately folded the photograph years ago. A crease ran directly through the young woman's image, as though someone had wished to hide her presence. That evening Mrs. Finch could think of little else. The unknown woman occupied her thoughts constantly. Who was she? Why had someone attempted to conceal her? And what connection did she possess to the trust scandal? The questions multiplied rapidly. Questions often did. Answers arrived more slowly. The following morning brought another development. Alfred Morris reappeared. To the immense relief of Willowbrook, he arrived home shortly after sunrise, dishevelled, and extremely reluctant to discuss where he had been. Inspector Blackwood questioned him immediately. The solicitor claimed he had travelled unexpectedly to visit an old friend. The explanation sounded weak. Even Morris seemed aware of that. His hands trembled throughout the interview. His answers remained vague. Most troubling of all, he appeared frightened, genuinely frightened. Blackwood noticed. So did Miss Finch. And fear, once again, became the most important clue in the village. That afternoon Mrs. Finch visited him personally. The old solicitor welcomed her politely. Yet his nervousness was impossible to miss. "You've had quite an adventure." "Nothing serious." His voice lacked conviction. Mrs. Finch sat quietly. For several moments neither spoke. Then she said, "Someone threatened you." Morris stared. The color drained from his face. The reaction was answer enough. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." The solicitor lowered his eyes. His shoulders sagged. Suddenly he looked every one of his years. "I cannot talk about it, because you're frightened." He nodded slowly. The admission hung heavily between them. Mrs. Finch felt sympathy. Fear could be a terrible burden, particularly for older people, particularly when connected to long-buried secrets. Did the threat concern Leonard Ashcombe? Morris hesitated, then nodded again. A chill passed through the room. That evening Mrs. Finch reviewed everything she had learned. The attack at the manor, the missing witness, the concealed photograph, the frightened solicitor. Individually, each clue seemed incomplete. Together they suggested movement. The mystery was shifting, changing shape, revealing new edges. And at the center stood the unknown woman from the photograph. Mrs. Finch felt increasingly certain she mattered, perhaps not because of who she was, but because of what she knew, or what she had known. The photograph had been taken shortly before the trust scandal, shortly before the broken engagement, shortly before Leonard Ashcombe left Willowbrook. The timing could not be ignored. As dusk settled across the village, Mrs. Finch sat beside her window and watched the shadows lengthen. The church bell struck 7. Children laughed somewhere in the distance. A dog barked. Ordinary sounds, comforting sounds, yet beneath them lay something darker. Someone was becoming desperate. The attack on the police officer proved that. The intimidation of Alfred Morris proved it even more clearly. The killer was afraid, and frightened people often made increasingly reckless decisions. Then, quite suddenly, a memory surfaced. Not a fact, not evidence, a pattern. Something she had seen many years earlier in another village. A man had stolen money. Everyone assumed greed motivated him. In reality, the theft concealed something else entirely. A relationship, a secret affair, a child. The stolen money had merely distracted attention from the real scandal. Mrs. Finch sat upright. Her knitting slipped unnoticed to the floor. For the first time she considered a startling possibility. What if the missing funds had never been the true secret? What if they had merely hidden a much larger one? A secret powerful enough to destroy reputations, powerful enough to end an engagement, powerful enough to inspire murder decades later. The thought lingered long after darkness filled the room, and somewhere beyond the quiet streets of Willowbrook a killer was running out of time. Because Mrs. Finch had finally begun looking in exactly the right direction. The mystery of the woman in the photograph occupied Mrs. Eleanor Finch's thoughts throughout the following week. She found herself returning to the image repeatedly, not merely because the young woman was unknown, because someone had attempted to erase her. People rarely went to such trouble without reason. The folded crease across the photograph had not appeared accidentally. Someone had wanted her forgotten, and when people wished to erase the past, Mrs. Finch had learned, it was usually because the past possessed inconvenient memories, or dangerous truths. The answer arrived unexpectedly, as answers often did, not through brilliant deduction, not through dramatic revelation, but through an ordinary conversation over tea. Mrs. Finch was visiting Miss Agnes Turner, the postmistress. The discussion wandered naturally through village history, old residents, former vicars, families long departed. Then Mrs. Turner happened to mention a name. Poor Margaret Ellis. Mrs. Finch looked up immediately. Who was Margaret Ellis? The postmistress appeared surprised. You don't remember her? I'm afraid not. Mrs. Turner stirred her tea thoughtfully. She taught at the village school years ago. When was this? 25 years ago, perhaps. Precisely the period Mrs. Finch sought. What became of her? The postmistress frowned. Nobody really knows. Mrs. Finch felt a slight tightening in her chest. She left? Very suddenly. The answer came quickly, too quickly, as though rehearsed over many years. Mrs. Finch recognized the pattern immediately. People remembered sudden departures, especially in villages, and they often remembered more than they admitted. That afternoon she visited the church archives. The caretaker helped locate old parish records, school reports, village newsletters, community photographs. Several hours passed. Then, tucked inside an old newspaper clipping, she found it. A photograph. The same young woman, this time clearly visible, smiling warmly beside a group of schoolchildren. The caption identified her immediately. Miss Margaret Ellis. Mrs. Finch stared at the image. At last, the mystery woman had a name. The question now became why someone had wanted her forgotten. The following day brought an even more surprising discovery. Margaret Ellis had not merely been a teacher. She had been remarkably popular. Villagers remembered her kindness. Children adored her. Parents respected her. Nothing in the records suggested scandal. Nothing explained her abrupt disappearance. The contradiction troubled Mrs. Finch, because people did not simply vanish from villages without explanation, not unless something significant had occurred. That evening she visited Alfred Morris once more. The retired solicitor looked tired, older somehow. Fear had a way of aging people. They sat together in silence for several moments. Then Mrs. Finch spoke. Who was Margaret Ellis? The effect was immediate. The solicitor froze. His expression changed completely. And in that instant Mrs. Finch knew she had touched something important. Very important. I don't know why you're asking about her. The denial sounded weak. Yes, you do. Morris lowered his eyes. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he sighed heavily. Good Lord! It was not an answer, but it was close. You remember her? The old man nodded. Everyone did. Then tell me. For several seconds he remained silent. At last he spoke. Margaret Ellis was engaged to be married. Mrs. Finch waited. To whom? His answer arrived almost as a whisper. Edward Pierce. Mrs. Finch felt a shock. Edward Pierce. Dr. Henry Pierce's father. One of the trustees. One of the men connected to the missing funds. The pieces shifted suddenly. A new pattern began emerging. What happened? Morris rubbed trembling hands together. It was a long time ago. Nevertheless, the solicitor stared toward the window. Rain tapped softly against the glass. The engagement ended. Why? No one knew. Mrs. Finch raised an eyebrow. You knew! Another silence followed. Then he nodded. What happened? The old man closed his eyes, as though revisiting painful memories. Margaret became pregnant. The room fell silent. For several moments neither spoke. In a modern city, such news might have caused limited concern. But 25 years earlier, in a small village, the consequences would have been devastating, particularly for a schoolteacher, particularly for an unmarried woman. Was Edward Pierce the father? The solicitor hesitated, then nodded. Mrs. Finch sat back slowly. The implications spread rapidly through her thoughts. A hidden pregnancy, a broken engagement, a sudden disappearance, and a woman erased from photographs. The story grew darker with every revelation. What happened to her? Morris swallowed. She left Willowbrook. And the child? A shadow crossed his face. I never knew. Mrs. Finch studied him carefully. He was withholding something. Not lying. Withholding. There was a difference. A very important difference. That evening Mrs. Finch reviewed everything she had learned. Margaret Ellis. Edward Pierce. A secret pregnancy. A vanished teacher. The hidden woman in the photograph. The connections multiplied rapidly. Yet one question remained unanswered. How did any of this relate to Leonard Ashcombe's murder? Then she remembered something. Leonard Ashcombe had recently returned to Willowbrook, after decades away, and shortly afterward he had begun meeting former residents, researching old events, asking questions, perhaps questions about Margaret Ellis. The possibility sent a chill through her. The next morning brought confirmation. A police search of Ashcombe Manor uncovered a notebook among Leonard Ashcombe's papers. Inside were names, dates, addresses, observations. The notebook appeared to contain private research. The final pages concerned only one subject, Margaret Ellis. Inspector Blackwood read the entries repeatedly. Each raised new questions. Ashcombe had clearly been investigating her. What had he discovered, and why had he been doing so only weeks before his death? The notebook offered no answers, only clues. Yet those clues pointed directly toward the past. The news spread quickly. By afternoon, Willowbrook buzzed with fresh gossip. Some villagers believed Margaret Ellis herself had returned secretly. Others suspected blackmail. Several imagined elaborate conspiracies. Most were wrong. Mrs. Finch suspected the truth would prove far simpler. Human nature usually was. Later that day she paid a visit to Dr. Henry Pierce. The doctor welcomed her politely, but she noticed tension immediately. His smile seemed forced, his movements slightly rigid. He looked like a man carrying a heavy burden. The conversation remained pleasant for several minutes. Then Mrs. Finch asked, "Did your father know Margaret Ellis?" The reaction was unmistakable. For a fraction of a second fear appeared, not surprise. Then it vanished, almost instantly. But not quickly enough. Mrs. Finch had seen it, and once seen it could not be forgotten. "Yes," Henry said carefully. "I believe they were acquainted." "Acquainted?" The doctor managed a smile. A small village, Mrs. Finch. An evasive answer, a deliberate answer, the kind that concealed more than it revealed. As she departed, Mrs. Finch felt increasingly certain of one thing. The Pierce family stood much closer to the mystery than anyone yet realized. Whether that meant guilt remained uncertain, but secrets certainly existed, and secrets had a habit of leaving traces, no matter how carefully they were buried. That night, while the village slept, Mrs. Finch sat beside her window watching moonlight spread across the gardens. Her thoughts returned once more to Margaret Ellis, a forgotten woman, a hidden pregnancy, a vanished life. Someone had gone to considerable effort to erase her from Willowbrook's memory, and Leonard Ashcombe had recently begun uncovering the truth. That could not be coincidence. The question was no longer whether Margaret Ellis mattered. She clearly did. The question was what final piece of information Leonard Ashcombe had discovered before his death. Something important enough to frighten someone. Something important enough to inspire murder. As the church clock struck midnight, another possibility occurred to her. A possibility so startling that she sat motionless for several seconds. If Margaret Ellis had borne a child, then that child would now be an adult, living somewhere, perhaps very nearby, perhaps even in Willowbrook itself. The thought lingered in the darkness, and for the first time Mrs. Finch began to suspect that the secret everyone sought was not hidden in the past at all. It was walking quietly through the village in the present, unrecognized, unaware, and dangerously close to the truth. The possibility that Margaret Ellis's child might still be connected to Willowbrook refused to leave Mrs. Eleanor Finch's mind. By the following morning it had become the center of her thinking. She sat at her breakfast table with a cup of tea growing cold beside her. Outside, sunlight spread across the village gardens. Inside, a far older story was beginning to reveal itself. A hidden pregnancy, a vanished schoolteacher, a wealthy man murdered shortly after investigating her past. The pieces were no longer scattered randomly. They were beginning to arrange themselves into a pattern. The difficulty lay in discovering the missing section at the center. Inspector Blackwood was pursuing a similar line of inquiry. The notebook recovered from Ashcombe Manor had transformed the investigation. Several pages contained addresses connected to Margaret Ellis. Others listed dates, train journeys, correspondence, fragments of research. Most intriguing of all was a final note written only 3 days before Ashcombe's death. The sentence was brief. The child survived, living closer than anyone suspects. Nothing more. No name, no explanation, no location. Only the tantalizing suggestion that Ashcombe had uncovered something significant. The inspector read the sentence repeatedly. Each time it irritated him further. Dead men, he reflected, possessed a remarkable talent for leaving incomplete information. Meanwhile, Mrs. Finch spent her morning at the county records office. Officially, she was researching local history. Unofficially, she was searching for Margaret Ellis. After several hours, she located a collection of archived birth records. The task proved slow. Yet Mrs. Finch excelled at patience. Patience frequently succeeded where brilliance failed. Near midday she found what she sought. A record from 24 years earlier. A child born in a neighboring county. The mother's name matched. Margaret Ellis. The father's name was omitted. Mrs. Finch was unsurprised. The omission itself revealed very little. Yet another detail caught her attention immediately. The child's surname was not Ellis. It was Martin. Mrs. Finch sat very still. Martin, a familiar name, far too familiar. The realization arrived slowly. Then, all at once, Lucy Martin, the vicar's daughter. Her mind raced, not because she believed Lucy was involved in murder. Quite the opposite. The young woman seemed incapable of deliberate cruelty. Number What interested Mrs. Finch was the surname, Martin, the same name recorded 24 years ago. A coincidence was possible, but in murder investigations coincidences deserved careful examination. That afternoon she visited Reverend Collins. The vicar welcomed her warmly. Yet when she casually asked about Lucy's family history, his expression altered slightly. Only slightly, but enough. Mrs. Finch noticed everything. Lucy was adopted, wasn't she? The Reverend stared. For a moment he looked genuinely shocked. Then he nodded. There it was, a fact few villagers knew. Lucy herself had always known she was adopted, but the subject was rarely discussed. What do you know of her birth mother? The Reverend hesitated. Very little. A lie. Not a complete lie, but a lie nonetheless. Mrs. Finch recognized it instantly. The vicar looked uncomfortable, almost guilty, and suddenly she understood why. Many years earlier, Reverend Collins's predecessor had helped arrange the adoption. Church records confirmed it. The infant daughter of Margaret Ellis had been placed with a childless couple. That couple's surname was Martin. The revelation sent a chill through Mrs. Finch, not because it solved the murder, because it connected the past directly to the present. Lucy Martin was Margaret Ellis's daughter. The discovery remained secret for only a few hours. Fate, as usual, intervened. That evening another tragedy struck Willowbrook. The second death came shortly after sunset, and unlike Leonard Ashcombe's murder, it contained no ambiguity, no mystery regarding the cause, only mystery regarding the motive. Alfred Morris was found dead. The retired solicitor's body was discovered near the river path that wound through the village outskirts. At first glance the death appeared accidental. A fall, a blow to the head, a tragic misstep. Yet Inspector Blackwood knew better immediately. The position of the body, the disturbed ground, the marks near the embankment, everything suggested violence. Someone had met Morris beside the river, and someone had killed him. The news spread through Willowbrook like a winter frost. Shock gave way quickly to fear. 2 deaths, a missing witness, an assault on a police officer. The village no longer felt safe. People locked doors. Curtains closed early. Children were called indoors before dusk. The atmosphere changed overnight. Murder had become something far more frightening, a pattern. Inspector Blackwood arrived at the scene shortly after dark. His frustration had evolved into determination. The second death altered everything. Morris had possessed knowledge. Morris had been threatened. Now Morris was dead. The conclusion seemed obvious. Someone believed he knew too much. When Mrs. Finch learned of the solicitor's death, she experienced not surprise but sadness. The outcome, unfortunately, had become increasingly predictable. Fear had been driving the killer, and frightened killers often made fatal mistakes. The question now was whether Morris had left anything behind, anything that might explain why he had become such a threat. The answer arrived the following morning. During a search of his house, police discovered a sealed envelope hidden inside a law book. The envelope contained a letter, written by Morris himself, addressed simply, "To whoever continues the investigation." Inspector Blackwood opened it immediately. Mrs. Finch was present when he read it. The contents stunned both of them. The letter described events from 25 years earlier. Not fully, not completely, but enough. Morris admitted that the missing trust money had never been the true scandal. The theft had been real, yet someone had used it to conceal another matter entirely, a matter involving Margaret Ellis, Edward Pierce, and a child. The letter ended abruptly. Before naming names, before identifying responsibility, before revealing the crucial truth, one final sentence stood alone at the bottom of the page. Leonard finally discovered what happened to Margaret. That is why he had to die, nothing more. For several moments neither Blackwood nor Mrs. Finch spoke. The room felt unusually cold. At last the inspector folded the letter carefully. "Whoever killed Ashcombe also killed Morris." Mrs. Finch nodded. "Almost certainly. And they were protecting something from 25 years ago." The inspector frowned. "But what?" Mrs. Finch gazed thoughtfully toward the window. The answer felt close now, very close, yet one crucial piece remained missing. A piece hidden within the relationship between Margaret Ellis and Edward Pierce, a piece someone had spent decades protecting. That evening Willowbrook seemed quieter than ever. The church bells sounded mournful. Rain drifted across empty streets. Lights glowed behind locked doors. Fear had become a permanent resident of the village, and somewhere among those cottages the killer was watching events unfold with increasing desperation. Mrs. Finch sensed it. The second murder changed everything, not because it created new questions, because it narrowed the possibilities. Only someone deeply connected to the past could have feared Alfred Morris. Only someone deeply connected to Margaret Ellis could have feared Leonard Ashcombe. The circle was shrinking, and at its center stood a secret child, a forgotten woman, and a truth that someone would kill repeatedly to keep buried. As darkness settled across Willowbrook, Mrs. Finch opened her notebook and wrote a single sentence. "The motive is no longer money. It is identity." She stared at the words for a long time. Then she closed the notebook, because for the first time since Leonard Ashcombe died with that strange smile upon his face, she believed she understood what the killer was protecting. Not a crime, not a fortune, a person. And once she discovered who that person was, the entire mystery would finally begin to unravel. The funeral of Alfred Morris took place beneath a sky the color of old silver. A fine mist drifted across Willowbrook throughout the morning, softening the outlines of cottages and hedgerows. Villagers gathered quietly in the churchyard, their dark clothing and solemn faces reflecting a grief made heavier by fear. 2 deaths in less than 2 weeks. A respected businessman, a respected solicitor. Neither had died naturally, and despite Inspector Blackwood's efforts, the murderer remained unidentified. The atmosphere in Willowbrook had changed completely. People no longer spoke openly. Conversations ended abruptly when strangers approached. Old friendships seemed strained. Trust itself had become scarce. As Mrs. Eleanor Finch watched mourners enter the church, she found herself thinking that murder rarely destroyed only lives. It destroyed certainty. And certainty once lost was remarkably difficult to recover. The service was simple, respectful, quiet. Yet Mrs. Finch noticed something unusual. Dr. Henry Pierce appeared deeply unsettled, not merely saddened, unsettled. His attention wandered repeatedly toward the church entrance. Several times he glanced behind him, as though expecting someone, or fearing someone. The behavior interested her greatly. Fear had become a recurring feature of the case, and fear, unlike many emotions, rarely concealed itself completely. After the funeral, villagers gathered in small groups outside the church. The usual conversations began, expressions of sympathy, discussions of weather, speculation disguised as concern. Mrs. Finch moved among them unobtrusively, listening, observing, collecting fragments. One fragment proved particularly interesting. It came from an elderly woman named Mrs. Gresham. "I always wondered what became of Margaret Ellis." The remark appeared casual. Yet another villager immediately responded. "Best forgotten." The tone surprised Mrs. Finch. Not dismissive, defensive, almost frightened. She filed the observation away. That afternoon Inspector Blackwood arrived at Rose Cottage carrying a folder. His expression suggested frustration, which usually meant progress. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Finch." "Inspector." He accepted tea gratefully, then placed the folder upon the table. "I believe we've discovered something important." Mrs. Finch waited. The inspector opened the file. Inside lay copies of several documents recovered from county archives. Property records, trust records, legal correspondence. One page immediately drew her attention. It contained a signature, or rather 2 signatures, apparently identical, yet not quite. "A forgery," said Blackwood. Mrs. Finch examined the document carefully. The differences were subtle, almost invisible, but they existed. One signature belonged to Charles Bennet. The other was a skilled imitation. The forged document authorized the transfer of trust funds shortly before the scandal erupted 25 years earlier. The significance was obvious. Someone had deliberately framed Charles Bennet. Someone had wanted suspicion directed toward him. The room fell silent. At last Mrs. Finch asked, "Who discovered this?" "One of our handwriting experts." Blackwood leaned back. Until now everyone assumed Bennet might have been responsible. "But he wasn't." "No." The inspector frowned. "Someone wanted him blamed." The implications spread rapidly. If Charles Bennet had been innocent, then Leonard Ashcombe had ended his engagement to Clara because of a lie. A lie carefully manufactured. A lie powerful enough to destroy multiple lives. Who benefited? Mrs. Finch asked quietly. Blackwood smiled grimly. "The same question I've been asking." It was the correct question. Not who suffered. Who benefited? Someone had gained enormously from the deception. The challenge lay in identifying them. That evening Mrs. Finch returned to her notes. For hours she reviewed every fact, every statement, every contradiction. The pattern continued growing clearer. The forged signature changed everything. because it transformed the trust scandal from financial misconduct into deliberate manipulation. Someone had engineered events, someone intelligent, someone patient, someone willing to destroy reputations for personal advantage, and perhaps willing to kill decades later. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Lucy Martin stood outside. She appeared troubled, more troubled than Mrs. Finch had ever seen her. "May I come in?"
"Of course."
Lucy entered quickly. For several moments she struggled to speak. "I think someone followed me." Mrs. Finch became very still. "Tell me." The young woman described her journey home from the church. Several times she had noticed the same figure, always at a distance, always watching, never approaching, yet always present. The account disturbed Mrs. Finch immediately, not because it proved danger, because it suggested interest. Someone was watching Lucy. The question was why. "Have you told anyone else?" Lucy shook her head. "No." The response surprised her. Mrs. Finch nodded thoughtfully. "If someone is watching you, we should not let them know we're aware of it." Lucy looked alarmed. "You think it's connected?" "I think everything is connected." And increasingly Mrs. Finch believed exactly that. After Lucy departed, Mrs. Finch remained awake long into the night. The young woman's story refused to leave her thoughts. If Lucy truly was Margaret Ellis's daughter and Mrs. Finch now felt almost certain she was then someone might view her as a threat, not because of anything she had done, because of what she represented. A living link to the past, a living reminder of secrets others wished forgotten. The following morning brought another breakthrough. Inspector Blackwood located a retired bank manager who had worked in the neighboring county during the time of the trust scandal. Age had weakened his memory, but not entirely. One detail remained vivid: a substantial withdrawal from the trust account shortly before the funds disappeared. The transaction had been authorized by a man, not Charles Bennet, not Leonard Ashcombe, not Reverend Matthews. The witness remembered because the man had seemed unusually nervous. "Who was it?" Blackwood demanded. The old banker hesitated, then answered, "Edward Pierce." The room fell silent. For several seconds nobody spoke. At last Blackwood thanked the witness and left. His thoughts were racing. Edward Pierce, Henry Pierce's father, Margaret Ellis's former fiancé, trust committee member, central figure in nearly every important event. The coincidence was becoming impossible to ignore. That afternoon Mrs. Finch paid another visit to Dr. Henry Pierce. This time, however, the conversation unfolded differently. The doctor's composure seemed increasingly fragile. Questions that once received calm answers now produced irritation. Mentions of his father caused visible discomfort, and when Mrs. Finch casually referred to Margaret Ellis, the reaction was immediate. Real fear, not grief, not embarrassment. For a moment neither spoke. Then Henry said quietly, "You should stop asking questions." The statement hung in the air. Mrs. Finch regarded him calmly. "Why?" The doctor looked away. "You may not like the answers." A curious response. Not there are no answers. Not you are mistaken. Simply that she might not like them. As she walked home through the village, Mrs. Finch considered the exchange carefully. For the first time since the investigation began, she felt she was standing directly before a doorway. Not the solution itself, but the entrance to it. Someone had forged documents. Someone had framed Charles Bennet. Someone had concealed the truth about Margaret Ellis. Someone had murdered Leonard Ashcombe. And someone had murdered Alfred Morris. Whether those actions belonged to one person or several remained uncertain. Yet the circle of possibilities was shrinking rapidly. That night, while rain whispered against the windows of Rose Cottage, Mrs. Finch spread her notes across the table. Names, datus, motives, connections. For nearly an hour she studied them silently. Then, quite suddenly, she noticed something she had somehow overlooked: a date. One particular date. The date Margaret Ellis had left Willowbrook. It matched almost exactly the date the trust funds disappeared. The realization struck her with surprising force. Not because it answered questions, because it connected two events everyone had assumed were separate. What if they had never been separate at all? What if the missing money and Margaret's disappearance formed part of the same story? The possibility changed everything. Mrs. Finch sat back slowly. A new pattern emerged before her eyes, and for the first time a single name began to occupy the center of that pattern. Not as a suspect, not yet, but as the key to understanding everything. Edward Pierce, the dead man's father, the forgotten fiancé, the trustee, the man who seemed connected to every secret in Willowbrook. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. Inside, Mrs. Finch closed her notebook. The mystery was entering its most dangerous stage, because the closer one approached the truth, the more dangerous the truth became. And somewhere in Willowbrook the killer had begun to realize that the truth was no longer safely buried. The storm that had threatened Willowbrook throughout the night finally broke just before dawn. Rain lashed against windows. Wind bent trees along the village lanes. The church bell rope knocked softly against stone inside the tower, producing a faint, ghostly rhythm that carried through the darkness. Mrs. Eleanor Finch was awake long before sunrise. The date she had noticed the previous evening continued to trouble her. Margaret Ellis had disappeared at almost exactly the same moment the trust funds vanished. For years everyone had treated those events as separate, yet the timing suggested otherwise. And timing, Mrs. Finch knew, rarely lied. People lied. Memories lied. Documents sometimes lied. But timing possessed a stubborn honesty. The challenge was understanding what it was trying to say. By mid-morning, Inspector Blackwood received an unexpected telephone call. The call came from a small solicitor's office in a neighboring county. An elderly clerk had recognized Margaret Ellis's name after reading recent newspaper coverage of the murders. The clerk believed certain documents stored in the firm's archives might be relevant. Within hours, Blackwood was reviewing a dusty collection of files untouched for decades. Most proved unimportant. Then he found a sealed envelope, yellowed with age, never opened, never delivered, addressed simply, Mr. Leonard Ashcombe. The letter was dated 25 years earlier, only weeks after Margaret Ellis had left Willowbrook. Inspector Blackwood stared at it for several moments before carefully opening the envelope. Inside was a single handwritten letter, and as he began reading, he realized he was holding one of the most important pieces of evidence yet discovered. Mrs. Finch arrived at the village hall shortly after noon. The inspector was waiting. His expression alone told her the discovery mattered greatly. Without a word, he handed her a copy of the letter. She adjusted her spectacles and began to read. Dear Leonard, if this letter reaches you, I hope you will believe what I am about to write. I did not steal the money. Neither did Charles Bennet. The story being told in Willowbrook is false. I know who took the funds, but I cannot prove it. I am leaving because remaining here would destroy more lives than it would save. There are matters I cannot explain fully. Perhaps one day the truth will become known. If that day comes, please remember that not everyone who remained silent was guilty. Some of us were simply afraid. Margaret. Mrs. Finch lowered the paper slowly. The room remained silent. Finally she spoke. She knew. Blackwood nodded. Apparently. What else? The inspector hesitated. There was another document. He slid a second sheet across the table. A legal statement. Witness. And never filed. Mrs. Finch read it carefully. Then read it again. Her heart quickened, because this document revealed something astonishing. 25 years earlier, Margaret Ellis had formally accused Edward Pierce of attempting to coerce her into signing a false statement regarding the missing trust funds. The accusation had never reached court. The complaint had never been pursued, yet the document existed, and it directly contradicted the version of events accepted by Willowbrook for decades. For several moments neither spoke. Then Mrs. Finch said quietly, Someone suppressed this. That's my conclusion. Blackwood folded his arms. If these documents had become public, the entire scandal would have unfolded differently. Indeed it would. Charles Bennet's reputation might have survived. Leonard Ashcombe might never have ended his engagement to Clara. Margaret Ellis might never have fled Willowbrook. Entire lives had been altered by lies. That afternoon Mrs. Finch sat alone in her garden. The rain had stopped. Sunlight filtered through damp leaves. Birdsong returned cautiously to the village. Yet her thoughts remained fixed on the past. The letter changed everything. Not because it identified a murderer, because it revealed motive, true motive. And motive often survived longer than evidence. For years, everyone had assumed the trust scandal involved greed, missing money, forged documents, financial misconduct. Now another possibility emerged. Desperation. Margaret Ellis had known something. Edward Pierce had feared something. And somehow those fears connected. Later that evening another development arrived. A search of Ashcombe Manor uncovered a hidden compartment inside an antique writing desk. The compartment contained several items, old correspondence, receipts, photographs, and one small notebook. The notebook belonged to Leonard Ashcombe. Unlike the earlier research journal, these entries were recent, very recent. The final pages had been written only days before his death. Mrs. Finch and Inspector Blackwood examined them together. The last completed entry read, Margaret told the truth. The money was never the real secret. Beneath that, Edward protected someone. And finally, Henry does not know. The final sentence sent a chill through the room. Henry does not know. Mrs. Finch read the words repeatedly. Their significance was enormous, because if Leonard Ashcombe had been correct, then Dr. Henry Pierce might not understand the full truth about his own father. Perhaps he was protecting a secret without knowing exactly what that secret was. Perhaps he had inherited a lie decades old, a lie someone was still willing to kill for. That night Mrs. Finch paid another visit to Clara Bennet. The librarian listened carefully as the older woman described some of the new discoveries. When the conversation turned toward Edward Pierce, Clara became unusually thoughtful. Then she said something unexpected. "I always wondered why Margaret left without saying goodbye." Mrs. Finch looked up. "You knew her?" "Everyone knew her." Clara smiled sadly. "She was kind." A pause followed. "She was also brave." The remark lingered in the air. Brave. An interesting choice of word. "What do you mean?" Clara stared toward the window. For several moments she seemed lost in memory. Finally she answered. "People thought she was running away. Wasn't she?" "No." The librarian shook her head slowly. "I always felt she was protecting someone." Mrs. Finch became very still. Protecting someone. The phrase echoed her own thoughts. Perhaps Margaret's departure had never been an act of surrender. Perhaps it had been a sacrifice. Walking home through the quiet streets of Willowbrook, Mrs. Finch found herself viewing the entire mystery differently. What if Margaret Ellis had remained silent for a reason? What if the stolen funds had merely concealed a deeper scandal? What if Edward Pierce had not acted solely to protect himself? The possibility unsettled her, because human beings were rarely simple. Villains often possessed virtues. Good people sometimes committed terrible acts, and the truth was usually far more complicated than anyone wished. Near midnight, Mrs. Finch sat beside her window, studying the notes spread across her table. The church clock struck 12. A fox crossed the lane outside. Somewhere in the village a light remained burning in an upstairs room. She barely noticed. Her attention remained fixed upon a single realization. For 25 years everyone had focused on the wrong question. The mystery was not, who stole the trust money? The mystery was, whom was Edward Pierce trying to protect? Because if Leonard Ashcombe had uncovered that answer shortly before his death, then the answer might explain everything. Margaret's silence, the forged document, the murders, all of it. Mrs. Finch felt closer to the truth than ever before, yet she also felt a growing sense of danger. The killer had already murdered twice, and if the secret truly involved someone's identity, as she increasingly suspected, then anyone approaching the truth could become a target, including herself. Outside, clouds drifted across the moon. Shadows moved across the village, and somewhere in that darkness a frightened murderer was beginning to realize that the past could no longer remain buried. Because after 25 years of lies, the truth was finally starting to surface. 3 days after the discovery of Margaret Ellis's letter, a stranger arrived in Willowbrook. At least she appeared to be a stranger. She arrived on the morning bus carrying a single suitcase and wearing a dark coat despite the warmth of the day. Few villagers paid her much attention at first. Visitors occasionally passed through Willowbrook. Most remained only briefly. Yet Mrs. Eleanor Finch noticed her almost immediately. Not because the woman stood out, because she seemed determined not to. People attempting to avoid attention often attracted it instead. The woman moved cautiously through the village square, pausing occasionally as though comparing reality with memory. That detail interested Mrs. Finch greatly. The woman was not seeing Willowbrook for the first time. She was seeing it again. By midday, Inspector Blackwood received unexpected news. The stranger had inquired about Leonard Ashcombe. She had also asked directions to the churchyard. More importantly, she had asked whether anyone remembered Margaret Ellis. The name transformed a curious visitor into a person of considerable interest. Within an hour, Blackwood arranged a meeting. Mrs. Finch attended as well. The woman introduced herself simply. Anna Foster. Her voice remained calm, yet beneath that calmness lay unmistakable tension. She was frightened, not terrified, but frightened enough to travel to Willowbrook after 25 years. "Why have you come here?" Blackwood asked. Anna hesitated. Then she produced a photograph from her handbag, an old photograph, faded with age. The moment Mrs. Finch saw it, she felt her pulse quicken. The picture showed 2 young women standing together outside a village school. One was Margaret Ellis, the other was Anna. "We were friends," Anna said quietly. "Very close friends." The room remained silent. At last Blackwood spoke. "You knew Margaret before she left Willowbrook? And afterward?" Anna nodded. The significance of that answer was enormous. For the first time someone had appeared who possessed direct knowledge of Margaret's later life. "What happened to her?" Mrs. Finch asked gently. For several moments Anna said nothing. Then she answered. "She never stopped being afraid." The words hung heavily in the room. Again that word. Again fear. The emotion at the center of nearly every important event in the case. Anna explained that Margaret had settled in another county under difficult circumstances. She had raised her daughter quietly, avoided publicity, avoided old acquaintances, avoided Willowbrook. At first the reasons seemed obvious. Scandal, the burden of the past. But Anna revealed something more disturbing. Margaret had believed someone was watching her for years. Anna shook her head. She never knew. Did she suspect anyone? Another pause. The room grew still. Edward Pierce. Inspector Blackwood leaned forward. "Why?" Anna's answer came softly. "Because she believed he knew something about the missing money." The statement was significant, yet it still failed to explain the murders. Mrs. Finch sensed there was more, much more, and Anna seemed reluctant to continue. Finally the older woman asked the question directly. "What are you not telling us?" Anna closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, she appeared exhausted, like someone carrying a burden for many years. "There was another person." The room became silent. "A person connected to Margaret?" Anna hesitated, then reached into her handbag once more. This time she removed a folded piece of paper, a birth certificate, one she had preserved for over 2 decades. Inspector Blackwood examined it first, then handed it to Mrs. Finch. The older woman adjusted her spectacles, read the document, and felt genuine shock. The certificate belonged to Margaret Ellis's daughter. The father's name had been entered, not omitted, not unknown, entered. The name read, Edward Pierce. For several seconds nobody spoke. The confirmation itself was not surprising. Mrs. Finch had suspected as much. What shocked her was something else. A notation added later. A legal amendment, one made years afterward. The document had been altered, and the alteration changed the child's identity. The child had been registered under one name, then renamed, not Martin, not Ellis, another name entirely. A name carefully removed from later records, a name that had disappeared, almost as though someone wished to erase it, just as Margaret herself had been erased. That evening Mrs. Finch reviewed every document again. The pieces were fitting together faster now. The hidden pregnancy, the forged records, the trust scandal, Margaret's disappearance, the murders. The connections tightened around a central truth. Yet one crucial question remained unanswered. Who had altered the records, and why? The answer arrived unexpectedly the following morning. Inspector Blackwood obtained access to old legal files connected to the adoption. The records revealed something astonishing. Edward Pierce himself had arranged many of the proceedings, not publicly, not directly, but through intermediaries. The discovery suggested extraordinary involvement, far greater involvement than anyone had previously imagined. When Mrs. Finch learned this, she felt a profound shift in her understanding of the case. For weeks, everyone had viewed Edward Pierce as a possible villain, a man hiding financial crimes, a man concealing scandals. Yet the evidence increasingly suggested something different. Edward had spent years protecting someone, perhaps desperately, perhaps foolishly, but protecting them nonetheless. The question remained, whom? That afternoon Mrs. Finch visited Dr. Henry Pierce once more. The doctor appeared exhausted, more exhausted than ever. The strain of recent events showed plainly upon his face. For several moments they spoke about ordinary matters. Then Mrs. Finch said quietly, "Your father was protecting someone." Henry looked away immediately. The reaction was unmistakable. He already knew, or suspected. "My father made mistakes." The doctor remained silent. "He carried guilt for most of his life?" Mrs. Finch watched carefully. "Guilt about Margaret?" Henry nodded, slowly, reluctantly, painfully. The conversation continued for nearly an hour. Yet when Mrs. Finch finally departed, one fact stood out above all others. Henry Pierce genuinely believed his father had acted out of remorse, not malice, not greed. Remorse. The distinction mattered, because remorse implied wrongdoing, but it also implied regret, and regret changed motives. That evening a final development altered everything. Anna Foster requested another meeting. This time she brought a small wooden box. The box had belonged to Margaret Ellis. It contained personal letters, photographs, keepsakes, and one sealed envelope. The envelope was addressed in Margaret's handwriting, to be opened only if anything happens to Leonard Ashcombe. The room fell silent. Inspector Blackwood stared. Mrs. Finch felt a chill run through her. Leonard Ashcombe had been dead for weeks, and Margaret, it seemed, had anticipated danger years earlier. Someone opened the envelope carefully. Inside lay a single page. The message was brief, terrifyingly brief. If Leonard is harmed, then the secret has been discovered. The truth concerns neither the money nor my child. The truth concerns what happened to Robert Matthews. For several moments nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The words seemed almost unreal. Robert Matthews, a new name, a forgotten name, a name never mentioned during the investigation. Yet Margaret clearly believed it mattered more than everything else, more than the trust funds, more than the adoption, more than the scandal. Mrs. Finch stared at the letter. A strange feeling settled over her, the sensation that accompanies a mystery when it suddenly changes shape. For weeks they had followed one path. Now another had appeared, and that new path led directly into territory nobody had explored. Who was Robert Matthews? What had happened to him? And why had Margaret Ellis considered him the true secret behind everything? Outside, evening shadows lengthened across Willowbrook. The village seemed peaceful, almost innocent, yet beneath that peaceful surface lay 25 years of lies. And now, for the first time, a new truth had emerged, a truth so important that Leonard Ashcombe had died for discovering it. Mrs. Finch folded the letter carefully, then looked toward Inspector Blackwood. Neither spoke. Neither needed to, because both understood the same thing. The mystery they thought they were solving was not the real mystery at all. The real mystery had only just revealed its name, and its name was Robert Matthews. The name Robert Matthews settled over Willowbrook like a shadow. For 2 days it seemed to exist nowhere and everywhere at once. No villager mentioned it. No records immediately explained it. No obvious connection linked it to Leonard Ashcombe's murder. Yet Margaret Ellis had written that it mattered more than the missing money, more than the adoption, more than her own child. And Margaret Ellis, Mrs. Eleanor Finch suspected, had been a woman who chose her words carefully. If she had pointed toward Robert Matthews, then Robert Matthews stood at the heart of everything. Inspector Blackwood began searching immediately. Church records, school records, property records, old newspapers, anything connected to the Matthews family. The investigation quickly revealed a surprising fact. Robert Matthews had been the son of Reverend Arthur Matthews, the same Reverend Matthews who had served as trustee of the Ashcombe Community Trust 25 years earlier, one of the 4 original trustees, one of the men standing in the photograph. The connection alone would have been noteworthy. What followed was astonishing. Robert Matthews had disappeared. Not recently, 25 years ago. Almost exactly when Margaret Ellis left Willowbrook, almost exactly when the trust funds vanished, almost exactly when the forged documents appeared. The coincidence was impossible to ignore. According to official records, Robert had left the village voluntarily. He was 19, popular, preparing to attend university. Then, without warning, he vanished. A brief notice appeared in the local newspaper. No scandal, no investigation. In the local newspaper, no scandal. No investigation, no body, simply a departure. The explanation seemed suspiciously convenient. Mrs. Finch sat quietly in the village library reviewing copies of the old reports. Across from her, Clara Bennet turned pages of a ledger. Neither woman spoke for several minutes. Then Clara said quietly, "I remember him." Mrs. Finch looked up immediately. "You knew Robert Matthews?" "Everyone did." Clara smiled faintly. "He was kind." The same word she had once used for Margaret Ellis. The description interested Mrs. Finch. Kind people often occupied unusual positions in mysteries, sometimes victims, sometimes witnesses, occasionally both. What happened to him? Clara stared out the window. "I always wondered that myself." "You never believed the story?" "No." The answer came immediately, without hesitation, without doubt. Mrs. Finch felt a chill. How many people in Willowbrook had quietly disbelieved the official version for decades? How many secrets had survived because nobody dared speak openly? That afternoon another piece of the puzzle emerged. Anna Foster discovered a bundle of letters hidden inside Margaret Ellis's wooden box. Most were ordinary, personal correspondence, birthday greetings, old memories. One letter, however, was different. The envelope bore no address, no stamp, no date, only a name, Robert. When Mrs. Finch read the contents, She felt the entire case shift beneath her feet. The letter had clearly never been sent. Margaret had written it shortly before leaving Willowbrook. The handwriting trembled in places. The wording revealed fear and affection. Deep affection, perhaps love. "Robert, I do not know whether I shall ever see you again. Everything is becoming worse. Edward believes silence will solve matters. Leonard suspects something. Your father knows more than he admits. If they discover the truth, nobody will survive it unchanged. I wish we had been braver. Margaret." Mrs. Finch lowered the page slowly. For several moments she simply stared at it. The implications were enormous. Margaret Ellis and Robert Matthews had shared a secret involving Edward Pierce, a secret Leonard Ashcombe had begun uncovering shortly before his death. The words that troubled her most were, "I wish we had been braver." Not the language of enemies, not the language of strangers, the language of people bound together by something deeply personal. That evening Inspector Blackwood made a remarkable discovery. An elderly resident of a neighboring village remembered Robert Matthews. More importantly, she remembered seeing him shortly after his supposed departure. Not abroad, not at university, not beginning a new life. He had been hiding, frightened, and accompanied by Margaret Ellis. The testimony transformed everything. For 25 years, the accepted story claimed Robert had simply left. Now evidence suggested otherwise. He had disappeared. There was a difference, a very important difference. Mrs. Finch spent much of that night reviewing her notes. The pattern had finally become visible. Not complete, but visible. She spread photographs across her table. Letters, records, datas. For nearly an hour she arranged and rearranged them. Then suddenly she saw it. The connection nobody had recognized. 25 years earlier, 3 young people had become trapped in the same secret. Margaret Ellis, Robert Matthews, Edward Pierce. Everyone assumed the relationship centered upon Margaret's pregnancy. Yet the letters suggested something larger, something capable of frightening powerful men, something capable of inspiring decades of silence. At midnight another memory returned to her. A conversation with Alfred Morris before his death. A single remark she had almost forgotten. The missing money was never the real scandal. At the time the statement seemed vague. Now it felt precise. The trust funds had been a distraction, a cover, a convenient explanation. The real scandal involved people, not money, identities, relationships. The following morning brought a breakthrough so significant that Inspector Blackwood immediately requested Mrs. Finch's presence. He was waiting at the village hall when she arrived. Without speaking, he handed her a document, an official death certificate, recently located, recently connected to Robert Matthews. Mrs. Finch read it carefully, then read it again. Her heart sank. Robert Matthews had died 24 years ago, only months after his disappearance. The death occurred in another county, under a different name. The body had never been connected to Willowbrook. The case had been ruled accidental. No investigation followed. No questions were asked. No one knew, or perhaps no one wished to know. For several moments the room remained silent. Then Blackwood said quietly, "Someone erased him." Mrs. Finch nodded. Because that was exactly what had happened. Robert Matthews had not vanished. He had been erased from records, from memory, from village history, just as Margaret Ellis had nearly been erased. The realization changed everything, because dead men could not threaten reputations. Dead men could not reveal secrets. Dead men were safe, conveniently safe. That afternoon Mrs. Finch took a long walk through Willowbrook. The village seemed unchanged. Children played near the green. Gardeners trimmed roses. The church bell rang softly across the rooftops. Yet she now viewed everything differently. The mystery was no longer about discovering what happened. The mystery was about understanding why. Why had Robert Matthews been erased? Why had Margaret remained silent? Why had Edward Pierce spent years protecting the secret? And why had Leonard Ashcombe died after uncovering it? As evening approached, the answer finally began to emerge. Not fully, not completely, but enough. Enough for Mrs. Finch to feel certain she was approaching the truth. A terrible truth. One capable of destroying reputations even after 25 years. One capable of explaining every lie, every forgery, every death. That night she sat alone beside the fire. The village lay quiet outside. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Her notebook rested open upon her lap. At the center of the page she had written 4 names: Margaret Ellis, Robert Matthews, Edward Pierce, Leonard Ashcombe. For a long time she stared at them. Then she drew a line beneath the final name, and wrote 3 words. He found out. Mrs. Finch closed the notebook, because for the first time since the murder at the summer fete, she believed she understood exactly why Leonard Ashcombe had been killed. Not every detail, not the killer's identity, not yet, but the motive, the real motive. And once motive was understood, the murderer rarely remained hidden for long. Somewhere in Willowbrook, a frightened killer was still trying to protect a secret, but the secret was collapsing, piece by piece, lie by lie, until only the truth remained. And the truth, Mrs. Finch suspected, would emerge very soon indeed. By the time Mrs. Eleanor Finch awoke the following morning, she knew two things with certainty. First, Leonard Ashcombe had not been murdered because of money. Second, the killer believed that a particular truth, buried for 25 years, was finally on the verge of emerging. The realization had arrived gradually, like dawn spreading across a landscape, one clue after another, one lie after another, until the shape of the past could no longer be denied. Yet understanding the motive and proving murder were very different matters. The police required evidence. Mrs. Finch required something else, human nature. Fortunately, human nature was often easier to predict. That afternoon she requested a private meeting with Inspector Blackwood. The inspector arrived at Rose Cottage carrying a notebook and an expression that suggested both curiosity and skepticism. He had learned enough about Mrs. Finch to recognize that such requests rarely proved unimportant. Tea was served. Polite conversation occurred. Only then did business begin. "I believe," Mrs. Finch said quietly, "that I understand what happened 25 years ago." Blackwood leaned forward. "Go on." For several moments she arranged her thoughts carefully. Then she began. "It started with Robert Matthews and Margaret Ellis." The inspector nodded. "Possibly." "No." Mrs. Finch smiled gently. "Certainly," she continued. "Robert Matthews and Margaret Ellis had been close, very close, perhaps secretly so. At the same time, Margaret was publicly engaged to Edward Pierce, a respected young doctor, a man with ambitions, a man whose future depended heavily upon reputation. The situation was already complicated. Then something occurred, something that threatened everyone involved. The pregnancy, Blackwood said. Mrs. Finch folded her hands. The pregnancy created a scandal, but not the central scandal. The inspector frowned. "What was?" Mrs. Finch looked toward the window. Rain drifted softly across her garden. When Margaret became pregnant, assumptions were made. Blackwood waited. Assumptions about the father. A long silence followed. Then understanding began appearing upon the inspector's face, slowly, very slowly. "You think Edward Pierce wasn't the father?" Mrs. Finch nodded. "I believe he wasn't." The room became completely still, because if that were true, everything changed. Absolutely everything. The engagement, the disappearance, the silence, the protection, the lies, all acquired a different meaning. Mrs. Finch continued. Margaret and Robert knew the truth. Edward knew the truth. Perhaps Reverend Matthews knew. The inspector stared. And Leonard Ashcombe eventually discovered it. Exactly. For several moments Blackwood remained silent. Then he asked the obvious question. If Edward wasn't the father, why protect the secret? Mrs. Finch smiled sadly. Because exposure would have destroyed multiple lives, and because, she thought privately, people often committed astonishing acts when attempting to preserve respectability, especially in small villages, especially 25 years earlier. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours. By the end, Inspector Blackwood looked deeply troubled, not because he disagreed, because he increasingly suspected she was correct, yet suspicion remained insufficient. Proof was needed. "And you believe you know the murderer?" The question finally arrived. Mrs. Finch answered carefully. Blackwood sat very still. The elderly woman shook her head. "Not yet." The inspector groaned audibly. "Mrs. Finch, I need proof." She smiled apologetically. "And fortunately I believe I know how to obtain it." That evening a series of invitations appeared throughout Willowbrook. They were simple, polite, entirely unremarkable. Mrs. Finch invited a small group of individuals to tea at Rose Cottage 2 days later. The guests included Clara Vennet, Lucy Martin, Dr. Henry Pierce, Anna Foster, Inspector Blackwood, Reverend Collins, and several others connected to the old scandal. The invitations caused considerable curiosity, yet nobody declined. The following day passed quietly, almost suspiciously quietly. Mrs. Finch spent most of it arranging details, preparing questions, reviewing notes, and considering people, because murder investigations ultimately concerned people, not evidence, not documents. their fears, their weaknesses, their secrets, and one particular person's fear now stood at the center of everything. Late that afternoon an unexpected visitor arrived, Dr. Henry Pierce. The doctor appeared exhausted. His face seemed older than ever, years older, as though the investigation itself had aged him. "May I speak with you?"
"Of course."
He entered. For several moments neither spoke. Then Henry said something surprising. "I think my father lied." Mrs. Finch remained silent, encouraging. "He carried guilt his entire life." The doctor stared at the floor. "I always assumed it concerned Margaret." A pause. "Nah, I'm not so sure." Mrs. Finch listened carefully. Henry continued. "There were things he never discussed, documents he destroyed, letters he hid." The strain in his voice was unmistakable. A son confronting the possibility that he had never truly known his father. "What are you afraid of?" Mrs. Finch asked gently. The question seemed to surprise him. He considered it, then answered honestly. A simple response, yet perhaps the most honest statement anyone had made since the investigation began. After Henry departed, Mrs. Finch sat quietly beside the window. Darkness was gathering. Across the village, lights appeared one by one. The scene looked peaceful. Yet beneath that peace tension stretched tighter each day. The killer was becoming increasingly desperate. She could feel it. The murders, the threats, the break-in, the surveillance of Lucy, all suggested mounting panic. And panic frequently produced mistakes. The mistake arrived sooner than expected. Shortly after midnight someone entered the church. The intruder remained only a few minutes, long enough to search a storage room, long enough to examine old records, then disappeared. Unfortunately for the intruder, Inspector Blackwood had anticipated exactly such behavior. Police surveillance had been established quietly. A witness observed the figure leaving, not clearly enough for identification, but clearly enough to establish one fact. The intruder was searching for something, desperately. The news reached Mrs. Finch the following morning. Far from surprising her, it confirmed her theory. Someone still believed evidence existed, evidence capable of exposing the truth. The question was what evidence, and why it mattered so much. That afternoon guests began arriving at Rose Cottage. The weather was pleasant. Tea waited on polished tables. The atmosphere appeared perfectly civilized, perfectly ordinary. Yet Inspector Blackwood noticed something unusual immediately. Mrs. Finch seemed remarkably calm, more calm than at any point during the investigation. The observation troubled him, because he suspected it meant she was certain. One by one the guests assembled. Clara Bennet, Lucy Martin, Anna Foster, Reverend Collins, Dr. Henry Pierce, Inspector Blackwood, several others. Conversation remained polite, nervous, occasionally awkward. Everyone sensed something important was about to occur. Nobody knew precisely what. Finally Mrs. Finch rose. The room gradually fell silent. She smiled gently, then began speaking, not about murder, not immediately. Instead she spoke about villages, human nature, memory, and how communities often protect comforting lies. The guests listened attentively. Some appeared confused, others appeared increasingly uncomfortable, especially one person. Mrs. Finch noticed, and so did Inspector Blackwood. For nearly 20 minutes she reconstructed the past. Margaret Ellis, Robert Matthews, the trust scandal, the forged documents, the hidden letters, the disappeared records, each piece placed carefully into position, each observation leading toward a conclusion. And with every minute one face in the room grew paler, one expression grew more strained, one person seemed increasingly desperate for the conversation to end. At last Mrs. Finch reached the final point. The room had become utterly silent. Even the ticking clock seemed unusually loud. She folded her hands, looked directly across the gathering, and said quietly, 25 years ago someone committed a terrible deception. A pause. Leonard Ashcombe discovered that deception. Another pause. Alfred Morris knew Ashcombe discovered that deception. Another pause. Alfred Morris knew part of it. The tension became almost unbearable. Inspector Blackwood found himself holding his breath. Then Mrs. Finch delivered the final sentence, the sentence designed not merely to accuse, but to provoke, to force a reaction, to expose the truth hidden beneath years of control. She looked directly at the person she believed was the killer, and said, "Yesterday I discovered the last surviving document proving what really happened to Robert Matthews." The effect was immediate, exactly as she had hoped, exactly as she had predicted. A flicker of shock, a flash of fear, a momentary collapse of composure. Brief, almost invisible, yet unmistakable. Mrs. Finch saw it. Inspector Blackwood saw it, and in that instant both knew the trap had begun to close. The room remained silent. No accusation had yet been spoken. No name had yet been revealed. But the killer had heard something terrifying. Not that suspicion existed. Suspicion could be managed. Not that questions remained unanswered. Questions could be avoided. The killer believed something far worse. That proof had survived. And frightened people, Mrs. Finch knew, often revealed themselves when they believed the truth had finally caught up with them. The final act of the mystery had begun. For several seconds after Mrs. Eleanor Finch's announcement, nobody moved. The gathering at Rose Cottage remained frozen in silence. Outside, a gentle summer breeze stirred the roses in the garden. Inside, tension filled the room like an invisible fog. Inspector Blackwood carefully watched every face, every expression, every movement. And there, exactly as Mrs. Finch had predicted, he saw it again. Not confusion, not surprise. The reaction lasted less than a second. Yet it was enough, because guilt often revealed itself in moments too brief for conscious control. Mrs. Finch remained standing beside the fireplace. Her hands rested lightly upon the back of a chair. Her expression was calm, almost gentle, the expression of a woman discussing village gardening rather than murder. But beneath that calmness lay certainty. After weeks of questions, the final answer had emerged. Now it only remained to explain it. "Before I continue," she said softly, "I should confess something." The guest looked at her. "There is no surviving document." A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Inspector Blackwood smiled faintly. Now he understood. The document had never existed. The announcement itself had been the trap, a carefully constructed lie designed to provoke the killer. And it had worked. Mrs. Finch turned toward Inspector Blackwood. "I believe we may stop looking for evidence hidden in papers." The inspector nodded. "Because the truth has always been hidden in people." She allowed the words to settle, then continued. 25 years ago, Willowbrook witnessed 2 tragedies. The first was visible. The trust scandal, the missing funds, the accusations, the broken engagement. She paused. The second tragedy remained hidden. The room became utterly silent. Robert Matthews and Margaret Ellis were in love. No one spoke. Some guests appeared surprised. Others did not. Deep down, several had already suspected. Margaret became pregnant. Mrs. Finch looked around the room. Everyone assumed Edward Pierce was responsible. A pause. He was not. Across the room, Henry Pierce lowered his eyes, as though some part of him had already known. Edward discovered the truth. Robert Matthews was the father. The revelation settled heavily upon the gathering, not because it was shocking, because it explained so much. "Unfortunately," Mrs. Finch continued, "Robert was the son of Reverend Matthews." She looked toward Reverend Collins. The old Reverend feared scandal. Edward feared scandal. Margaret feared scandal. Everyone feared scandal. And in the England of 25 years earlier, fear of public disgrace could be devastating. So they created a lie. The room remained silent. A lie intended to protect reputations. A lie intended to protect families. A lie intended to protect the unborn child. The missing trust funds had become the perfect distraction. Money attracted attention. Money created confusion. Money allowed people to focus upon crime rather than personal scandal. Someone forged documents. Someone directed suspicion toward Charles Bennet. And amid the chaos, Margaret quietly disappeared. "Who stole the money?" asked Blackwood. Mrs. Finch nodded. The question everyone asked. She smiled sadly. And the wrong question. Edward Pierce had taken the funds, not for personal enrichment, not permanently. The money was hidden and later returned through indirect transactions impossible to trace at the time. The theft had been staged, a deliberate diversion, a smokescreen, an attempt to conceal the true scandal. But something went wrong, Mrs. Finch continued. Something had indeed gone wrong, terribly wrong. Robert Matthews refused to accept the arrangement. He wanted the truth known. He wanted Margaret acknowledged. He wanted responsibility accepted openly. Arguments followed, bitter arguments, and then Robert disappeared. The room remained silent. No one dared interrupt. For years everyone assumed he simply left. Mrs. Finch folded her hands. He did leave. A pause, but only because he was persuaded to. Edward Pierce arranged for Robert to leave Willowbrook temporarily until matters cooled. The intention had not been malicious, at least not initially. Yet Robert never returned. Months later he died, alone, under another name, a tragic accident. No conspiracy, no murder, just misfortune. But the result was the same. The secret remained buried. Several guests released quiet breaths. The explanation seemed heartbreaking, yet it still failed to explain 2 recent murders. Mrs. Finch knew exactly what they were thinking. Then Leonard Ashcombe returned. The room grew still again. There it was, the crucial moment, the turning point. After decades abroad, Ashcombe had begun investigating old regrets, old mistakes, old wounds. His broken engagement to Clara Bennet troubled him deeply. He discovered the forged documents. He discovered Charles Bennet's innocence. He discovered Margaret Ellis's sacrifice. And finally, he discovered the truth about Robert Matthews. Leonard intended to reveal everything. Mrs. Finch's voice softened. He intended to clear the innocent, to correct the past, to restore damaged reputations. The irony was painful. After 25 years, Leonard Ashcombe had become the one man determined to tell the truth. And that truth terrified someone. Mrs. Finch slowly turned. Her gaze settled upon Dr. Henry Pierce. The doctor's face had become pale, yet she did not accuse him. Not yet. Henry Pierce was not protecting himself. She spoke clearly, firmly. He was protecting his father. The doctor closed his eyes. Years earlier, Henry had discovered fragments of the truth. Not everything, only enough. Enough to understand that his father had committed fraud. Enough to understand that multiple lives had been damaged. Enough to understand that exposure would destroy the Pierce family's name forever. When Leonard Ashcombe began uncovering the past, Henry panicked. Not out of greed, not out of hatred, out of loyalty, misguided loyalty. But loyalty nonetheless. Inspector Blackwood spoke quietly. "You believe Henry murdered Ashcombe?" Mrs. Finch nodded. "Yes." The room remained silent. Henry Pierce did not deny it. That alone told everyone present a great deal. "The poison?" asked Blackwood. Mrs. Finch continued. "Henry had access to medical substances unavailable to most villagers. He learned Ashcombe planned to make public announcements after completing his research. He panicked. He poisoned the drink, then carefully directed suspicion toward Thomas Reed, a convenient suspect already burdened by financial troubles. "And Alfred Morris?" Blackwood asked. The doctor's shoulders sagged. The fight had left him. Morris knew enough to unravel the deception. When Henry realized the old solicitor might speak openly, he arranged a meeting near the river. The confrontation became heated. Morris threatened disclosure. In panic, Henry struck him. A single blow. No one moved. No one spoke. Only the ticking clock filled the silence. At last Henry opened his eyes. Tears stood there. Not theatrical tears. Not self-pity. "I never meant to kill Alfred." His voice trembled. The words emerged almost as a whisper. Inspector Blackwood said nothing. He did not need to. The confession had begun. For several moments, Henry remained motionless. Then he spoke again. "I thought I was protecting him. My father." A pause. "He spent his entire life regretting what happened." Another pause. "I couldn't bear seeing everything destroyed." Mrs. Finch regarded him sadly. The tragedy was complete now. A son had inherited guilt that was never truly his, then allowed that inherited guilt to become murder. Finally, Inspector Blackwood asked the question that had lingered since the beginning. The smile? Every eye turned toward Mrs. Finch. The smile on Leonard Ashcombe's face. She nodded. For weeks it had remained the mystery at the center of the case, the strange expression, the unsettling grin, the final image seen by dozens of villagers. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't mockery. It wasn't poison. The room grew silent. Only days before his death, Leonard had uncovered the truth, the whole truth, about Margaret, about Robert, about Clara, about the forged accusations, about the lives ruined by fear. And shortly before stepping onto the platform that afternoon, Leonard received confirmation, the final piece, the answer he had sought for 25 years. He finally knew Clara's father had been innocent. He finally knew he himself had been wrong. He finally knew Margaret had sacrificed everything to protect others. He finally knew Robert Matthews had loved courageously. For the first time in decades, Leonard Ashcombe was at peace. The smile, Mrs. Finch said softly, was simply happiness. The realization settled over the room. Quiet, melancholy, profound. Leonard Ashcombe had gone onto the stage intending to correct old wrongs, to seek forgiveness, to tell the truth. And in the final moments of his life, he believed he would finally be able to do so. That was why he smiled. No one spoke. For several That was why he smiled. No one spoke. For several moments silence filled Rose Cottage, a silence not of mystery, but of understanding. Outside, the afternoon sun shone across Willowbrook. The village looked much as it always had. The same cottages, the same gardens, the same church. Yet something fundamental had changed. A secret buried for 25 years had finally emerged, and with it came consequences, painful truths, long-delayed forgiveness, and perhaps healing. As Inspector Blackwood escorted Henry Pierce away, the doctor paused at the door. For a brief moment he looked back, toward Mrs. Finch, toward Lucy Martin, toward the people whose lives had been shaped by old lies. Then he lowered his head and left. The mystery was over. The truth had won, though not without cost, and as Mrs. Eleanor Finch watched the door close behind him, she reflected upon a lesson she had learned many times before. People rarely committed terrible acts because they were monsters. More often they committed them because fear convinced them they had no other choice. Fear of disgrace, fear of loss, fear of truth. And in Willowbrook fear had finally lost its power. The secret was gone. The lies were finished. And at last the dead could rest, including Leonard Ashcombe, the man who smiled because at the very end he finally understood the truth. Autumn arrived gently in Willowbrook. The leaves turned gold and copper. Morning mist drifted across the village green, and the roses that had bloomed so brightly during the summer gradually surrendered to the season's chill. Life, as it always did, began to move forward. The murders that had once dominated every conversation slowly retreated into memory. Not forgotten, never entirely forgotten, but no longer the center of daily life. The bakery once again concerned itself with cakes and bread. The tea-room returned to debates about flower shows and church fundraisers. Children played on the green where Leonard Ashcombe had given his final speech, and the church bell continued marking the passage of ordinary days. Yet beneath the appearance of normality, much had changed. Truth had a way of doing that. Dr. Henry Pierce eventually pleaded guilty to the murders of Leonard Ashcombe and Alfred Morris. The village received the news with a mixture of sorrow and relief. Few people found satisfaction in his downfall. His crimes had been terrible, yet many understood that he had not acted from greed or ambition. He had acted from fear, fear that had slowly consumed judgment, fear inherited from mistakes that were never truly his own. The tragedy seemed to belong not to one generation but to two. The revelations surrounding Edward Pierce transformed how Willowbrook viewed its own history. The truth emerged gradually, not through scandal, not through sensational headlines, but through facts, records, and testimony. The forged accusations against Charles Bennet were finally acknowledged. His name, after decades of suspicion, was cleared completely. For Clara Bennet, the vindication brought emotions she had not expected. One afternoon she visited her father's grave. She remained there for nearly an hour. No one knew what she said. No one asked. Some moments belonged only to the heart. When she returned to the village, those who knew her noticed something different. The sadness remained, but the burden had lightened. At last her father had received justice. Perhaps the most profound changes touched Lucy Martin. The discovery of her true origins unsettled her deeply at first. For weeks she struggled with questions about identity, about family, about belonging, questions with no simple answers. Mrs. Eleanor Finch visited often during those difficult weeks. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they merely drank tea together in silence. Both were useful. Eventually Lucy came to understand something important. Learning the truth about her past did not erase the life she had lived. The Martins had loved her, raised her, protected her. Nothing could change that. Yet she also found comfort in learning about Margaret Ellis. Not the scandal, not the gossip, the woman herself. Her courage, her sacrifices, her kindness. And in time Lucy began to feel not divided by her history, but enriched by it. She belonged to both stories. Anna Foster remained in Willowbrook for several weeks, long enough to visit old places, long enough to share memories, long enough to help complete a story interrupted 25 years earlier. Before leaving, she placed Margaret Ellis's letters in the village archive, not hidden, not locked away, preserved, a reminder that truth deserved remembrance, even when painful, especially when painful. The greatest surprise came several months later. A memorial plaque appeared inside the church. Simple, modest, unpretentious. It bore 3 names: Margaret Ellis, Robert Matthews, Leonard Ashcombe. Beneath them was a short inscription: "Truth waits patiently. Eventually it finds its voice." No one publicly claimed responsibility for arranging it. Most villagers suspected Clara Bennet. Mrs. Finch suspected the same. Neither ever mentioned it. As for Rose Cottage, little changed there. Mrs. Eleanor Finch continued tending her garden, continued knitting, continued observing the world with quiet interest. Visitors still sought her advice, though she always insisted she possessed no special talent, only experience and curiosity, two qualities she considered greatly underrated. One crisp October afternoon, Inspector Blackwood stopped by for tea. The mystery had been solved for months, yet one question still lingered in his mind. After discussing weather, village matters, and the alarming decline of proper manners among modern motorists, he finally asked it. "Did you know it was Henry from the beginning?" Mrs. Finch laughed softly. "My dear Inspector, certainly not." Blackwood looked surprised. "No?" "No." She poured tea carefully. "I merely knew that people reveal themselves eventually." The inspector smiled. And they did. For a few moments they sat quietly, watching autumn sunlight dance across the garden. Then Blackwood asked, "What do you think this case was really about?" Mrs. Finch considered the question seriously. The answer deserved thought. Finally she said, "Regret?" The inspector raised an eyebrow. "Not murder?" "No." She shook her head gently. "The murders were the consequence." A pause. "The real story was regret. Regret for words unsaid. Regret for truths concealed. Regret for courage not shown when it mattered most." The inspector reflected upon this, then slowly nodded, because he understood. After he departed, Mrs. Finch remained in the garden. The afternoon sun was beginning to fade. Leaves drifted lazily from the trees. Somewhere beyond the hedges children laughed. Life continued, as it always did. Her thoughts wandered briefly to Leonard Ashcombe, to Margaret Ellis, to Robert Matthews. 3 lives forever connected by choices made long ago. How different things might have been if someone had spoken the truth sooner. How many sorrows might have been avoided. Yet speculation, she knew, was rarely useful. People lived the lives they were capable of living, not the lives they wished they had lived afterward. The church bell sounded softly across Willowbrook. Mrs. Finch looked up. The familiar sound echoed through the cool autumn air, comforting, timeless, much like the truth itself. Truth could be delayed, ignored, buried beneath lies for years, even decades. But eventually it emerged, not because justice demanded it, not because detectives solved mysteries, but because human beings could not carry secrets forever. Sooner or later the weight became too great, and the truth found a way home. Mrs. Finch smiled faintly, then returned to her knitting as the autumn evening settled gently over Willowbrook, and for the first time in many years the village was finally at peace. The end.